So guys, what if Naruto banished and had cosmic divine powers from Zeus movie 2? I can't take it anymore. Blinking in surprise when he heard the emotionless voice, the god of the underworld and ruler of the dead turned away from the reports in his hands and gazed at the figure stood across from him. The reports were the judgment rulings from the judgment pavilion, detailing the new arrivals to the underworld and where the souls of the departed ended up. Looking at the stack of reports on the table beside his throne, it would take him the better part of the day to get through. Standing in the doorway with a pair of skeletons stationed on either side, his daughter, Melinoe, stood in all her frightening glory, ruling as the goddess of ghosts. His daughter opted to wear an appearance straight out of a mortal's nightmares, with half of her face black and hardened like a corpse, and the other half pale and chalky. She looked like a mortal's night terror come to life. In the handful of occasions that Melinoe showed herself to a mortal in her dual form, they would either pass out from fear or suffer a full breakdown. Most cold looked past her frightening form, with many in their Olympian family above ground questioning her sanity. Why would a goddess who could take any form she wanted, take a form of something so hideous? Most were not kind, and though deep beneath the earth, Hades heard the whispers about his daughter. The one that always stoked his anger was the one claiming Zeus was her father, fathering Melinoe with Persephone, resulting in her appearance. Oh, how he would love to get his hands on the person who started that one. Staring at his daughter, his eyebrow raising on his pale face. Explain. It came out more like a grunt than a question. Walking across the throne room, Melinoe stopped at the platform leading up to the throne of Hades and curtsied to her father. "You're sulking." Again, Hades blinked in surprise. "Excuse me?" "I said you're sulking," she repeated, her arms crossing in front of her and leaned on her right leg. "Normally when mother returns to Olympus for the spring and the summer, you become broody and miserable to be around. I've grown accustomed to your behavior after all these millennia, but this year you've been worse." Hades cold stopped the frown appearing. "Do I need to remind you who you're speaking to, daughter?" he asked. His voice was deep, with the walls humming and shaking after each word. The others would be too afraid to stand in Hades' presence. The goddess of ghosts merely scoffed. His daughter's sass was too much like Persephone's. The mother and daughter combo were two of a handful of people that didn't fall prey to the fear that the eldest son of the Titan King extruded. The only people besides them who fell in that category was his elder sister, Hestia, and naturally, his mother. The former queen of the Titans never failed to see the good in her oldest son and would often visit him when she decided to come out of her self-imposed exiles. "No, father, but I have noticed a change this year. Mother's absence appears to be affecting you worse this time than in all the previous ones." Her dark eyes, which were reminiscent of freshly earthed coal, gazed into his own, with the goddess taking 2 steps forward until she stood on the first step of the platform. "I'm not sure why, but I noticed the two of you were all ovey-dovey with each other during the last weeks of winter, especially after Valentine's Day." The god of the underworld slouched, a disgruntled hum resonating from his throat. "So, out with it, why are you in the dumps?" she prodded, patiently waiting for an answer. The god of the underworld was not one to talk about his feelings to anyone besides Persephone, but his daughter's words weren't untrue. Persephone's absence from the underworld had been harder to accept these past weeks, and the elder god was having a difficult time not feeling his wife's presence by his side. Time with Persephone was always joyous for Hades, granted. When they first got together, the first century of their marriage had been an adjustment for the spring goddess. Gone was the green hills and flowery meadows she had grown up in its place, she had to adjust to her new surroundings of death and darkness. Everything was foreign and unknown to her, if truth be told. Hades wasn't sure if Persephone could adjust to the lifestyle that came with being a resident of the underworld. So, instead of waiting for her to adjust, he made it easier and adjusted parts of the underworld to help the process along. Her garden was the first step and proved to be the best positive step he could've taken. Had seen her eyes light up and visibly noticed the tension between them lessen. When she turned around to thank him, she gave him the first real smile had seen her wear. Since then, all Hades wanted to do was make her smile. His fellow underworld deities, namely Charon, Thanatos and occasionally Hecate when she visited, had all come to accept the spring's goddess's presence. Back to Melinoe's accusations. Before Persephone left for Olympus, their marriage was doing good. No, better than good. They'd been doing amazing. Since they returned from the fox's den, Hades and Persephone had been in a bubble that neither wanted to leave. It was the best they felt in a long time. It was as if their time visiting the mortal establishment had rejuvenated their marriage, injecting fun and love into the veins of matrimony, and made the weight of their godly duties as light as feathers. It was like they were connected by an invisible rope, for neither went anywhere without each other. The other gods residing within the underworld noticed the change in their lord and were all pleased for the positivity floating around them. A happy Persephone led to a happy Hades, a happy Hades led to a happy underworld, and a happy underworld was good for everyone involved. "It's nothing," Hades said quietly, his left hand scratching against against the armrest of his throne. His hand felt empty without his wife's petite one filling the void. I feel your mother's absence more this season, that's all. The goddess of ghosts said nothing, but she did sympathize with her lord and father. While she and her mother were two vastly different goddesses, the goddess of spring would always find the time to spend with her daughter. Persephone was an attentive mother and could hold back her enthusiasm, unlike the goddess of the harvest, for the first couple of centuries. Melinoe acted how a moody mortal teenager would act around their parents. She tried to shrug her off and stick to the shadows and caves she loved so much within her home. However, Persephone was persistent. She would often say Melinoe acted like her father, being rough and cold on the outside, but with a center that was warm and cuddly. She denied it vehemently, but deep down, her mother wasn't wrong. It wasn't just Hades who missed the presence of Persephone. The spring goddess has become an irreplaceable pillar in their lives. I miss her too. It came out as a whisper, but Hades had heard her words. You do? Of course, Melinoe stated in a matter-of-fact tone. Perhaps it would be a good idea for you to get out of the underworld for an afternoon. And go where? Melinoe shrugged, no idea, but I'm sure it would be a better alternative to sulking around at home. I don't sulk, Hades replied, a frown washing over his face. I brood, there's a difference. Melinoe raised an eyebrow, not really. Brooding means to think deeply about something that makes you unhappy. Sulking is a form of self-pity and childishness, she told him, before tapping her chin. Oh. I guess you embody both right now. In that case, stop brooding and sulking and get out of the underworld for an hour or 4. You do remember him, the parent here? Not to mention the divine ruler of the underworld. Yes, father, so you've mentioned 500,000 times in the last century alone. Hades hummed his dissatisfaction, but didn't voice his annoyance. Perhaps his divine daughter was correct. Maybe he did need to get out of the underworld for a while, at least, for an afternoon. Every time he entered the master suite of his home, he felt his wife's presence. In recent years, Persephone would leave a bottle of her perfume on her dressing table, the one that smelled like primrose and tulips freshly blossomed in the spring. His wife's touch within their home was everywhere and served to make him feel lower than he already did. Odds, he missed her. It was during her absence that his faithfulness to their marriage would often become tested. The oath of the big three that he, Zeus and Poseidon took after World War II came at the right time. Hades was intent on ensuring his wife was the only one he shared a bed with. Thanatos could run the underworld in my place for an afternoon, Hades muttered. The god of death was his right-hand man and his trusted ally against the gods of the Greek pantheon, outside of Persephone and Melinoe. He might even say Thanatos was one of a handful of people the god of the underworld could call his friend. He didn't care much for Olympus, though his friendship with his warmongering nephew was bizarre. Then again, war and death went hand in hand on the battlefield. A reasonable choice, although I could faithfully fill in while you're away, Melinoe reasoned. Thanatos holding down the fort was a good idea, but as the daughter of Hades, and having spent most of her life within its walls, she felt there was no one better qualified to look after the underworld in her father's stead. Oh no, he retorted, shaking his head and gazing down at his daughter with certainty. If I'm going to the surface world, then you're coming with me. Your mother and I talked about the idea of taking you up to the surface more often, and today seems like a good place to start. If I have to go, then so are you. What? Her voice raised a few octaves, and her mouth parted into an O shape. I have no desire to journey to the surface world. I'm needed here. I have important duties to attend to. A snort broke out of Hades and saw through her words. If you call scaring the mortals that occupy the fields of punishment with your entourage of ghosts, then all the more reason for you to come with me. The god of the underworld gave his daughter a look. You've become a creature of habit. It might do you some good to get outside every once in a while. How many times can you scare Tantalus and Sisyphus until it starts getting old? You've been doing it for centuries. The goddess puffed out her cheeks. This is about you and your sulking. Don't turn this around on me. Brooding, Hades reiterated. It might have started that way, but now I think this could be good for both of us. Some fresh air might do us good. But no buts, this is happening. Besides, your mother would kill me if she found out you and I weren't spending time together. A wicked grin smirk washed over his face. If your mother can handle being out of her comfort zone for 6 months on Olympus and forced to spend time with my airheaded sister, then you can survive a few hours in the surface world. You haven't left the underworld in nearly a decade. The goddess of ghosts tried to speak, but no words were coming out of her mouth. How did her father manage to turn this around and make it about her? You need to get out more, my daughter. This isn't happening. Looking through the menu provided, Hades could feel the glare coming from the other side of the table. His daughter was angry at him. The goddess of ghosts had sparsely spoken a word since he all but dragged his gloomy daughter out of his palace. She attempted to make a break for it and hide in one of the many caves that she had set up around the underworld, but Hades had been faster, treating her like she was a little goddess again. The eldest son of the Titan King threw his daughter over his shoulder and carried her away. The act was enough to shock her for a mere moment before beginning to curse him from behind. Her protests went ignored, though he let out a grunt when she dug her knee into his shoulder. It got worse when they passed Charon, who laughed at Melinoe's expense. Even the mortal souls being ferried across the Styx pointed at them and got a kick out of her situation. Most wouldn't have imagined the god who many referred to as the Silent One, the Rich One, or his personal favorite, the Father of Fear, would do such a thing. It was such a, dare he say, intimate thing, and very unlike a god with the reputation he carried. However, Hades would argue that despite that reputation, he was still a father, and as much as Melinoe drove him crazy, he did love her. If Hades wanted to embarrass his daughter in front of other gods, then that was his right as a parent. He knew Olay Thunderthighs on Olympus did the same thing to his children when he got the chance, and the same with Squid for Brains down in Atlantis. Embarrassment, a parent's greatest weapon against their children. I want to go home. Her words made him sigh, and Hades peered over the menu to look at her. Gone was the half-pale, half-corpse form she wore around the underworld. Instead, his daughter wore the look she was born with. From the day she was born, Hades marveled at the similarities between Melinoe and Persephone. Every little detail, whether it was her nose, her chin or the shape of her eyes. They screamed Persephone. Her eyes were a mismatched pair, with a blue left eye from Persephone, and an intense black eye inherited from himself. The feature was a rarity amongst the gods, though why she hid them was a mystery to him. Her skin was pale, much like himself, and her dark hair was untidy but beautiful, falling in messy ringlets from the bun it was tied in. Her clothes were another matter entirely, and couldn't have been more different from Persephone's. She wore dark jeans with rips around the knees and shins, and her feet with covered in top-of-the-line Converses that didn't have a speck of dirt on them. Her top half was in a black Beatles t-shirt and a leather jacket that fit perfectly around her petite frame. If he recalled, the mortals called this being punk. He sighed and shook his head. He didn't understand kids and their angsty feelings. Too bad, you're staying, so you might as well have a look through the menu. It might surprise you. Father, Melinoe leaned forward. The front of the building is orange. It makes Apollo's temple look like a piece of art in comparison. Who in their right mind would paint the front of a building orange? Hades held his hand up. He wouldn't refute the color of the building dug into his skin. The bright color went against everything he represented. Believe me, Melinoe, I know. Then tell me, why are we here? Because you said I should get out of the underworld, and this is where I want to go. I like this place. Gods, that was hard for him to say. The food here is top quality stuff, and the drinks aren't half bad either. Those desserts your mother and I brought home with us on Valentine's Day were from here. He gestured to the room. When he and Persephone returned from their outing on Valentine's Day, they stopped in to visit their daughter before retiring to their chambers for the evening. Melinoe had taken one bite before she devoured the portions of desserts they brought for her. The fig tea cake was gone before the elder god could blink. Hades had to give her his portion, listening to her whine until he gave in. Odds, why were the women in his life so skilled at wrapping him around their fingers? That was from here. It was. The goddess of ghosts swallowed hard, and Hades noticed her visibly relax in her seat. Maybe it wouldn't be a terrible idea to browse through the menu and see what they offered. Well, she wasn't a glutton. Melinoe did enjoy the odd treat here and there. The desserts her parents brought home with them had filled her necessary sugar requirements for weeks, not to mention. The moment she walked inside the quaint little cafe, she felt her body relax as the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled her nose. Perhaps staying for an hour wouldn't hurt. Her curiosity was piquing. Mother has good taste with these types of establishments. Maybe I will like it here. She picked up the menu and flicked to the first page, ignoring the frown on Hades' face. Your mother's taste. I'm the one who brought you here. Against my will, and I bet it was mother's idea to come here, which means, if you like it, it's only because she dragged you here in the first place, right? There was a quip in her voice, the type that women used when they knew they were correct. On the other side of the table, Hades kept silent and drifted back to the menu. Damn brat, he thought. She had her mother's wit too. Looking at the menu, he flicked the page back to the one with the list of coffees. Amaretto flavored coffee. How did I miss that first time round? The father and daughter sat in silence, ignoring the hustle and bustle from the mortals around them. It didn't look to be a busy day. Plenty of tables and booths were vacant, though plates were still half filled, and mugs were half full. I wonder why, he thought, giving Melinoe a flat look. The goddess of ghosts had been in such a mood that her divine power started leaking from her control. Well, they walked the streets of the West Village, though it wasn't close to the level the god of the underworld could exuberate from his form. It was enough to make people shake in their shoes. People on the street avoided her like the plague. Running in the opposite direction, storefronts closed their doors to keep her from walking in. The moment Melinoe stepped inside the fox's den, the room felt them appear. For once, Hades wasn't the one scaring people away. Melinoe gave the mortals, nymphs and satyrs a single cold stare before half the room got up and bolted out the door, bowing to them as they left. Knowing where the menus were kept, Hades grabbed a set before sitting down in the middle of the room. Mr. Underhill, he heard and looked up to find the familiar blonde making his way over to the table. I didn't think he'd be seeing you so soon. Welcome back, Underhill. Melinoe mouthed. but Hades waved the question away. The shinobi of old sensed the man coming, but had been too busy keeping the clones in the kitchen occupied. Moments earlier, one of the clones succumbed to boredom decorating a carrot cake and decided to mess with one of the others. One cupcake to the back of the head was enough for an argument to break out, one which the original needed to see to himself. The last thing he needed was for a dozen clones spilling out of the kitchen to the clientele. "Thank you," Hades nodded up at Naruto politely and shook his hand. And the notepad appeared in Naruto's hands. "I see you found the menus. I remember noticing where you kept them, I hope you don't mind." The blonde shook his head, "Not at all." He looked over and found Melinoe staring up at him, an equative look on her face. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met." He offered his hand. "I'm Naruto Uzumaki, the owner of the Fox's Den. It's nice to meet you." She eyed him curiously. She was a bit put off when he kissed her knuckles, an action he used when meeting Persephone for the first time. "It's nice to meet you too," Melinoe replied quietly. She tilted her head. Her mismatched eyes stared into his sapphire-like ones. "This is my daughter," Hades started, but remembered the phone names Persephone gave them during their last visit. Thinking on his feet, Hades hoped Melinoe wouldn't be too insulted. "My daughter, Megan." "Your daughter." Naruto's eyes widened and stared at Melinoe. He leaned his head back, taking in her features as his smile grew wider. "Yeah, I can see the similarities between her and Mrs. Underhill. If I didn't know any better, I would have said they were sisters. We get that a lot." The god swept a hand through his hair. Persephone was young when she had Melinoe, that and good genes. "That must be it," Hades heard, ignoring the glare Melinoe was sending his way. His daughter wasn't keen on her alias. "Tough luck, if I have to wear the name Hank, then so can't she." "So, where's the missus today?" Naruto asked, glancing away from his notepad and pen. In front of him, Hades sat with the menu in his hands, his dark eyes peering up at him from the corners. As always, Hades was dressed in an immaculate black suit, though a dark red pocket square sat in the breast pocket, a skull ring made of gold wrapped around his index finger. The ring had been a gift from his wife after their wedding anniversary. The goddess of spring loved her jewelry, and while Hades was happy to accommodate with his endless supply of riches at his disposal, she surprised him one year by gifting him with a ring. Despite being the queen of the underworld, Persephone was not into the whole skulls and darkness look, despite how much he enjoyed the way it. "Nice suit by the way, Armani." "Thanks and a good eye," Hades praised. "As for my wife, she is, otherwise occupied, away on business." "I see," the blonde replied. "When's she coming back?" "It would be great to see her again." "I'm sure you are," Hades said, lacking surprise in his voice. Persephone was well liked by most she came into contact with. "Well, you may catch a glimpse of her from time to time if you're lucky. She splits her time between our business ventures and her family. Half the year she's with me, and the rest she's with her family and their business. She works closely with her mother." "I see." The blonde caught wind of the way Hades spoke about Persephone's mother. "Let me guess, you and your in-laws don't get along." The god of the underworld snorted, as did Melinoe. The goddess of ghosts sat quietly and listened as her father spoke with a mortal. It was strange watching a mortal have a normal conversation with her father. The man practically invented the word fear, and this guy was none the wiser. "That would be an understatement," Hades replied. His hand toyed with a ring on his finger, twisting it around and rubbing the face with his thumb. "Her mother despises my very existence. She holds me responsible for anything that goes wrong in her daughter's life, as well as her own. She sounds like a real piece of work." "She is." Though silent, Melinoe agreed with her father. Her relationship with the goddess of the seasons was non-existent, despite her appearance resembling her beloved and favorite daughter. Demeter had never reached out to her, and Melinoe was never sure why. Her feelings towards the goddess were null and void. She didn't hate her, but she didn't feel any love for her either. "Well, my father-in-law used to be the same way. He wasn't keen on me at first, thought his daughter could do better, but he came around over time," Naruto shared. He pictured Hiashi in his mind, wearing his famous stern scowl and Hyuga robes. "He was a tough nut, but I wore him down. Maybe your mother-in-law will change one day." "It's unlikely, but I respect your optimism," Hades said back, his dark eyes scanning Naruto's blonde ones. I'm ready to order Meg." He couldn't stop his lips from twitching in a smirk when his daughter huffed her annoyance. "Yes, I think I'm ready too." "Then, ladies first." Naruto looked at Melinoe and patiently waited for her response. Taking a final look at the menu, the goddess of ghosts placed it on the table. "Do you serve breakfast food all day? Or is it strictly for mornings?" "I do them all day." "In that case, I'll get a stack of pancakes. Could I get half with blueberries and the other half with chocolate chips?" "Sure." He jotted the order down. "Would you like a pot of syrup on the side?" The dark-haired goddess nodded. The options were in the corner of the menu, and one stood out to her, the orange maple. "You got it." Jotting it down, he finished by asking, "And what would you like to drink?" "The coffee, please, 2 sugars with cream." "Nice and simple, I like it." He sent a smile her way, and the goddess couldn't help the edge of her lips twitch up. Across the table, Hades noticed it too, and felt his lips twitch up. "And for yourself?" His turn, Hades copied his daughter's actions by folding the menu and neatly placed it on the table. I think he'll take the amaretto coffee. His dark eyes glanced up at the blonde. I don't remember that on the menu last time. It's new, I added it the other week, so far it's been a hit with the customers. Naturally, the god thought, Hades doubted anything on the menu was going to leave someone dissatisfied. If gods like himself was pleased by what the blonde presented, then mortals were a no-brainer. With the coffee, I think he'll have the same as my daughter. Could I have maple syrup on the side please, and could I add banana slices and bacon with my pancakes? The blonde nodded, you can, great pick, thanks. Taking their menus, Naruto gave a short bow, he'll be back with your orders shortly. The pair nodded and watched as the blonde got to work. Hades turned to his daughter, well, he seems nice, for a mortal anyway, I can see why mother likes him. Hades hummed, your mother has a soft spot for mortals with manners and talent. He admitted, it's not often I meet a mortal, much less a mortal man who doesn't appear bothered by my presence. Most would turn tail and run in the opposite direction. It's a refreshing feeling. I'm sure it is. The fear her father excluded from his powers could force mortals to have a heart attack on the spot if not controlled. The inside is nice too, though, it could use some darkening, maybe black walls, or a dark purple, some candles replacing the lights, would give it a more rustic and Victorian theme. One of your favorite periods if I recall, you spent many years mingling with the mortals back then. Melinoe shrugged, everyone was so easy to scare back then, ghost stories were everywhere, and Victorian houses were perfect for haunting. Mortals were very gullible back then, it was my paradise. She sighed and leaned in her chair. Victorian England was so much fun. Giving them nightmares was so easy back then and manipulating their mind to make them see things that weren't there was second nature. The mortal world got boring afterwards. If you behaved yourself, then you could have enjoyed it for longer. Do I need to remind you that if left to your own devices you would have exposed us? Hades reminded. A stern tone was laced in his voice. Let's not forget about that incident with your half-brother. Rolling her eyes, Melinoe let out a grunt. You're never going to let that go, are you? Her father sired a demigod during the height of the Victorian era, and the son of Hades had been a budding doctor back in the day. His talent and craft were enough to impress their father. It was rare to find a demigod son of Hades, whose profession in life was saving lives, rather than taking them. Melinoe, on the other hand, saw it as a chance to have some fun with her half-sibling, unseen from the shadows. She slowly plucked away at his sanity and didn't understand the damage she was imposing until it was too late. To say it didn't end well would be an understatement. You tormented your brother's mind for years, and it twisted him into England's most infamous killer. You got carried away, and in the end, Artemis and her hunters had to hunt him down and put an end to him before he took any more lives. The elder wrinkled his nose, not one to give credit to one of Zeus' brood, but her actions were necessary, and she was right to take action. It didn't help that one of the women he killed had been the daughter of the love goddess. His interactions with Aphrodite was limited, but she'd given him an earful at that year's winter solstice. As annoying as she was, she did care for her children, and the unjust death of one had earned him her ire for years. I remember, Melinoe said quietly, crossing her arms and showing signs of remorse. I got carried away by the fear, and I didn't see what it did to him before it was too late. I've never let it happen again since then. I know not to get carried away. Her torment on the demigod was not her best moment. She regretted her actions. She would take it back if she could. She let her fun get carried away, and it ended with lives taken and her father dragging her back to the underworld. Across the table, Hades nodded and clasped his hands together on the table surface. In all fairness, compared to the bad deeds of the rest of our Olympian family, I'd say your track record is rather good. The gods of Olympus were far from perfect, and Hades included himself in that list. Even Persephone had moments she wasn't proud of. Some of the things the gods did to mortals, whether intentional or otherwise, were hard to imagine. In truth, the stories the world knew about them was barely scratching the surface when it came to their history with mortals. One blip is far better than anyone else in our family, excluding Hestia of course. I'd say your slate is cleaner than most. I'm proud of you for not turning out like the rest of your Olympian cousins. Swallowing thickly, his daughter let out a small hum. Hearing praise from her father's lips was rare, and Melinoe tried her hardest not to stare owlishly at him. Maybe it was this place. It was making her father, dare she say, sociable. Why are you staring at me like that? Adjusting herself, Melinoe sat cross-legged on the chair, something her mother frowned at when sat around the dinner table. No reason, though. I'm starting to think you're beginning to turn sappy in your old age. Watch it, otherwise, this old man will spank you in front of every mortal in this room. You won't dare. I really would. Melinoe humphed, though the edge of her mouth was tugging into a smile. Her old man could be bizarre sometimes. Falling quiet, the goddess turned her attention to their patron and eyed the blonde as he prepared their drinks. As the goddess of ghosts, her divine power when it came to the underworld was dwarfed only by her father, her mother not so much, with Persephone's powers tied closely to the fertility of the earth, she adopted the powers of the underworld, meanwhile. Hers and her father were born with them, with her connection to the dead, and her divinity connecting to the spirits and ghosts' houses between the walls of the underworld. She felt when the souls were ruffled, when she was above ground, and when she focused on an individual mortal, she could feel all those tied to the people who rest within the underworld. This man's ghosts were old, very old, older than she ever sensed an immortal before. It was bizarre. Melinoe hummed again. It's strange, every ghost and spirit that passes through the underworld creates a thread, an attachment that links back to me, as the goddess who looks over the domain of ghosts. I can feel the thread stemming from him that link back to the underworld, and I can feel the threads attached to people in the underworld, the ones they share a bond or strong feelings towards in whatever form that takes. Her frown deepened. I can't put my finger on it, but the ghosts tied to him are old, older than I've ever felt. It'd have to make a trip past the Judgment Pavilion to find anything concrete. There were many levels to the area. The souls of the mortals were kept and split into 3 sections. They were the fields of punishment, the asphodel fields and Elysium. A 4th existed and was known as the Isle of the Blessed. The number of souls that resided there was few and far between. The underworld was always expanding, making room for the influx of souls daily. In mortal terms, it was like a highway with new intersections forming and leading off to new areas housing souls. The further down you went, the older the souls that resided there. Her gaze returned to her father. If my suspicion is correct, then father hasn't noticed. She made a TSK sound with her mouth and looked away from the elder god. Honestly, has become complacent in these years of peace. He can't see what's right in front of him. There didn't appear to be any evil intent. It was the opposite. The man had been a gentleman since her arrival and put her at ease. However, the blonde man presented a mystery for the goddess of ghosts, and Melinoe wanted to unsolve the enigma that was Naruto Uzumaki. Putting a pin on her suspicions, Melinoe straightened up when the blonde made a beeline for them, gently placing 2 cups of steaming drinks on their table. Melinoe was quick to grab the handle and bring it up to her lips. Whoa, hold on. She heard and felt Naruto lean in next to her. It's hot, so make sure to blow on it first. I don't want you burning yourself. Her cheeks flushed at the statement, and she didn't need to look at her father to know he was smirking. She wasn't a child. Reigning in her embarrassment, she gave him a subtle nod. Of course, thank you for warning me. Smiling, Naruto left to finish up their order, while Melinoe held up a hand to her father. Not a word. I didn't say anything. Then stop thinking too loud. I don't think that's a thing. Growling, Melinoe ignored her father and did as the mortal suggested, gently blowing on the top of her coffee. Melinoe let out a low hum of delight as the warm liquid passed through her mouth and down her throat. Gods, that was a good cup of coffee. The goddess didn't like her coffee too strong, but the way the blonde mixed, it was perfectly proportionate to how she liked it. Not too sweet, not too bitter, and with the right amount of milk. Perfect, that's good. Surprised, Melinoe looked at her father, a hum of contentment reverberating from his mouth as he took a long swig of his amaretto coffee. His shoulders visibly slumped against his chair and watched as he tilted his head back and let out a sigh of relief. I needed this, she heard him say to no one, and watched as a genuine smile tugged at his lips. Well, it'll be. This place did help her father relax. Not even the most qualified masseuse her mother had on standby in the underworld could make the god of the underworld sigh in contentment to such a degree. It wasn't long before Melinoe felt the mortal's presence at the table again, this time with 2 identical plates in his hands. Lowering both to the table, Melinoe tried and failed to stop her tongue from slipping out her mouth, salivating at the pancakes like a dog with a juicy bone. They looked delicious and were stacked 6 pancakes high. Warm butter sat in the center of the top pancake, but the yellow substance melting through the top layer. If Melinoe had to guess, he made them moments ago, since the chocolate from the chocolate chips were still in the process of melting. The goddess could only imagine the warm and gooey goodness that awaited her tastibids. I can barely wait. Hades was in a similar state. Both father and daughter were eager to dig in. They didn't have to wait long. The second Naruto turned his back, Hades and Melinoe poured each of their syrups over the top of the pancakes. Somehow, they restrained themselves until the syrup flowed on each side of the stack. Before long, they were digging their forks in their meals. As soon as the pair felt the food hit their divine tongues, it was like fireworks going off inside their bodies. It was like their tastibids were assaulted on every side of their being. An unrelenting wave of fluffy sweetness. Hades knew what he was in for, but Melinoe was caught off guard and cold stopped her face from contorting into an expression of pure radiance. If one looked closely, you could see her pale skin gain a hint of color to it and a dust of gold spreading across her cheeks. Beneath the table, Melinoe was tapping the floor with her shoes like a dog having its shin scratched. Oh my god, she thought, falling against the back of her chair while her hands continued to cut off pieces from her pancakes. I've never tasted anything like this before. The best chefs in the underworld has nothing on this. Her home had the best of the best from every profession imaginable. On many occasions, her family would pluck a soul or two with exceptional skills to bedazzle them with their talent. In her long life, the goddess of ghosts could answer honestly and say no mortal had ever made such a meal this amazing. It was no wonder her parents liked this place. If this was the kind of food you received every time you visited, it was no wonder it attracted such attention. She bit her bottom lip, keeping a guttural moan from escaping her throat. The god and goddess stayed at the fox's den for most of the afternoon, ordering plate after plate of the pancakes and racking up a stack big enough for the other customers to take notice. Whatever foul mood Melinoe was in when she arrived earlier that day was gone and found herself enjoying her time in the mortal world for the first time in over a century. Hades, though his mind lingered on his wife, felt his misery subside. He was planning a future visit with his wife when she returned to Underworld in the autumn. Maybe the owner could create some Halloween-styled food for us. It's Persephone's favorite holiday, so I can only imagine what kind of delicacies the mortal will create. A bubble of excitement sparked to life in his chest, and Hades could only wish the spring and summer months would pass by quickly. In the middle of the afternoon and making small talk between bites, Melinoe's gaze would repeatedly return to Naruto, watching him quietly as he continued his day. As impressive as his culinary skills were, her interest in the mystery that revolved around him increased. To have such a powerful and emotional connection with the souls of the underworld was unusual. Just who is this guy? The mystery presented itself, and Melinoe intended on finding some answers. Prepare your bows. The voice belonging to Zoe Nightshade, Lieutenant of Artemis and veteran member of the Hunters of Artemis, carried itself across the pine grove deep inside Forest Park. She stood to attention off to the side of the hunters' camp, her hands clasped together behind her back like a drill sergeant. Her dark eyes were focused and emotionless. Scanning over the group of young girls that stood in a single file line, each girl was upright, their feet shoulder-width apart and toes pointing in 90 degrees at the target dummies set up 30 meters away from them. All of the inanimate objects looked like pincushions, dozens of arrows sticking out from them, girls all dressed identical. But the silver parka jacket and green camouflage pants, their hair was all braided, with some flicking over their shoulder and others resting along their spine. Yes, Lieutenant. Like they trained for, each girl kept a relaxed grip on the bow handle and knocked their arrow with their other free hand. Remember to position your fingers on the string with the index finger above the arrow and keep the middle and ring finger below it. Following her instructions, the girls all did so in unison. Do not grip the arrow with your fingers, pull back the string using your back muscles, not your arm, Zoe warned. Pull back until your index finger is under your chin and the string touches nose and lips. Once you're comfortable, use your dominant eye to line up the shot. The girls did as they were told and steadily began lining up their shot with the dummies. It took a matter of seconds before Zoe was pleased with what she saw. The newest members of the hunt had come a long way in the last couple of months. This time a month ago, she was still showing members like Eloise and Lucy the proper stance when preparing to fire an arrow. Relax your grip on the string and allow your fingers to slip backwards. After shooting, maintain your body position until I tell you. Ignoring the tickle on the tip of her nose from the chill, she stood still as the familiar sounds of arrows whooshing through the air reached her ears. A smile tugged on the corners of her mouth. Was there a better sound in the world than arrows gliding through the air? If there was, she didn't know what it was, nor did she care for it. Gazing across the archery field the hunters temporarily created for themselves, she examined the training dummies now filled with arrows. Two in the left lung, one in the shoulder, one to the kidney, one that would have sent the target's intestines spilling across their lap. The final arrow hit its target directly in the right eye, with zero chance of survival. Not bad at all. Nodding, Zoe walked onto the field and faced the waiting hunters. They were all still in their shooting positions, waiting for her to give the order to drop their stances. Okay girls. Silence hung over them as they eagerly awaited her verdict, though their faces gave nothing away. Good job, drop your stances. A sigh of relief rung through the field, and Zoe was forced not to roll her eyes as half of the lineup dropped to the ground, their arms and legs splayed out like a star. The others remained standing, though their shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Ow, my fingers are killing me. Who knew shooting arrows could be so exhausting? I've got blisters on my blisters. If they thought that was bad, then they have no idea what they've signed up for. Zoe didn't bother turning around, recognizing the voice of the only member of Artemis Hunt whose tenure expanded past her own. Whereas Zoe's tenure with the hunt was over 2,000 years, Phoebe's was even longer, somewhere around 2,500 years if the ginger-haired hunter's count was correct. I hope they know that I won't heal injuries as trivial as this. I'm sure they know. As Hunters of Artemis, it's expected of them to be aware of what injuries dictate the attention of our medic. As a daughter of Apollo and one as old as Phoebe was, there wasn't many woes knowledge in the healing arts, surpassed the larger girl. Though there was no love between the daughter of Apollo and the god of the sun, there was no denying the demigod had inherited her father's aptitude for medicine, which included her inheritance of Apollo's vitikinesis abilities. The ability to manipulate the healing process was a skill few children of the sun god were lucky to inherit, and the demand for such individuals was high. Wherever you went, to this day, Phoebe was the only one Zoe was aware of who was still alive. None of the sun god's current batch of children at Camp Half-Blood had yet to prove themselves capable of the skill. I've made sure to drill that into their heads. I have no doubt. Clapping her hands, Zoe drew the attention of the 6 hunters back to her. Pick yourself up, girls. Training might be over, but the day isn't, and I know you still have chores around the camp to complete." A groan rang out between the girls and forced the lieutenant of the hunt to narrow her eyes. "I wasn't asking if you wanted to or not, it's that, or bathing the wolves in the nearby creek." Suffice to say, the threat of bathing the wolves was enough for the six to backpedal from their groans and made a beeline for the camp a short distance away. A snort came from Phoebe, who shook her head. "Sometimes, I wonder about the girls Melody allows in joining the hunt. I don't remember Atlanta, or Alessandra, or anyone from the old day groaning about such trivial things. It's expected for the members of the hunt to pull their weight and not force their sisters to carry their workload for them. It's like girls from the current era can't do anything but groan about every little thing." So couldn't help but agree, the girls of the modern world were vastly different from the ones that existed in the old day. Back in ancient Greece, humanity needed to learn vital skills to survive. Men and women needed to know how to hunt for their food, whether that be tracking a deer or fishing in a nearby creek. They needed to know how to forage for medicinal herbs and explain what made one deadly and made the other life-saving. Build a fire, stitch together their clothing, learn to wield a weapon of some kind. Every day was a battle, and those who got through another day could enjoy the small victory of surviving longer than another. And again, she could also accept that the way of life was vastly different. The world had grown in a way that no one could have imagined, not even the gods. No one could have expected things like healthcare, supermarkets, and televisions would ever exist. Well, it was nice to have these luxuries in life. Zoe felt they made the new girls that joined the hunt lack a drive that hunters like herself and Phoebe possessed. The world has changed, it's not the same one we once knew. Ain't that the truth? Arriving back to the hunt's latest campsite, the lieutenant and medic stood in the center and watched as the Hunters of Artemis carried out their chores. More than a dozen silver tents were set up in the shape of a crescent moon, with a fire set up in the middle, with logs big enough to seat 5 or 6 girls to huddle on in the evening. Like most evenings, the girls would spend their downtime sitting around the campfire, a giant bag of s'mores courtesy of Lady Hestia to share getting passed around. If she was lucky, she could get her hands on 2, maybe 3 before they all disappeared. The hunt didn't have many luxuries, but Zoe counted the treats as one of the few. At this moment in time, the hunt numbered precisely 3 dozen girls, ranging from the ages of 12 to 16. The most populous the lieutenant remembered the Hunters of Artemis reaching was around 50, but that had been years ago. That was back in the old day when nymphs and other beings of nature would join them in their adventures. These days, nymphs stuck to their natural environment, and often the hunt was comprised with little more than demigods and clear-sighted mortals. Their number always fluctuated. Some would leave willingly, having fallen into the pitfall trap of falling in love. Others would break their vows and take a dishonest approach. As kind as Lady Artemis was for giving young girls somewhere to call home, she didn't tolerate or trust being abused and broken. Some though gave their lives for the hunt, and their souls rested together eternally in the underworld. As grateful as Zoe was for her long life, the sadness of watching friends die never lessened. Before she could get lost in her thoughts, a light appeared from the center tent. Across the camp, everyone stopped what they were doing as the light dimmed, and the zip to the center tent began opening up. The moment Artemis appeared, everyone in the camp took a knee, their heads lowering as they showed respect to their patron and adoptive mother, as she often would. The goddess of the moon reverted to her 13-year-old form, the average age of her hunters. "Melody, welcome back," Zoe greeted, being the first of the girls to get back to her feet and approach the Olympian. One by one, the girls around the camp followed suit and returned to their chores and duties. Phoebe copied Zoe's actions and approached the auburn-haired goddess. "Zoe, Phoebe," Artemis replied, smiling at her veteran and most trusted huntresses. "Training with the girls was a success, I hope." "Yes, Melody, I'm happy to say none of the girls missed the training dummies this morning, and I saw no visible flaws in their stances." "Good, as always, you have done a splendid job with the recruits." When she wasn't around, it was Zoe's job to keep the girls on their toes. The last thing Artemis wanted during their breaks between hunts was the girls becoming complacent. The newer girls, in particular, needed to keep training until everything felt like second nature. "I trust none gave any attitude." "None, Melody. I have ensured they know what will happen if they do not follow orders." It was safe to say no matter how respected the lieutenant of the hunt was amongst her sisters, there was a healthy amount of fear when it came to the veteran huntress. "Glad to hear it." Quietly watching the exchange, Phoebe frowned when she noticed something off about the goddess's appearance. "Melody," she motioned to the corners of her mouth. "You have something around your mouth." Did the goddess have crumbs around her mouth? And flecks of icing? The red-haired daughter of Apollo recognized the residue instantly, having seen Artemis devour an entire tray of cookies courtesy of Lady Hestia on many occasions. The goddess of the moon thought no one was looking when she swept through the sugary treats, but in reality, they couldn't help but gawk in wonder at their patron's extreme sweet tooth. Embarrassment consuming her, Artemis swiftly turned around and hurriedly wiped away the crumbs from around her mouth. The pair could hear her mumbling beneath her breath, something about chalking out the stupid blonde when she saw him next, and how dare he refuse to tell her she had food left over on her face. Was she talking about Apollo? Or maybe Aphrodite? Neither knew of anyone else who could get such a response from the Olympian. Blinking like a pair of owls, Zoe and Phoebe looked at each other silently before turning back to Artemis. "Is everything alright, Milady?" "Yes. Yes. Everything is fine. Were those crumbs around your mouth?" "Cake crumbs?" Yes they were. I treated myself to piece of cake earlier," the goddess admitted. "It was delicious. You know how I get with sweet treats, the whole world disappears." "I see." Zoe's face morphed into a frown. "May I ask where you disappeared to?" "I don't remember you mentioning where your intended destination was." She didn't want to say anything before, but recently, the lieutenant of the hunt had noticed her Olympian patron and adoptive mother disappearing more frequently than usual. Often Artemis would leave her in charge of the hunters when she needed to attend a meeting of the Olympian Council, or if the goddesses were convening for one of their meetups. Often, their goddess would meet up with Lady Athena and spend sisterly time together, and the hunters were all for it. Lately, these visits were becoming more frequent. Not only that, but Artemis would also go for hours at a time, sometimes the whole afternoon. Beforehand, Zoe wouldn't have said a word. She would have done her duty and kept her nose out of her lady's business. However, this was the second time this week Artemis vanished without telling someone from the hunt where she was going. She wanted to bite her tongue, but Zoe hoped her fearless leader wouldn't be insulted by her curiosity. "I went to a cafe in West Village." "Oh? That was easy." "The West Village? It's one of the districts in New York, I think," Phoebe added, though her face looked confused like Zoe's. "I'm not big on the layout when it comes to the concrete jungle. Give them a week in the forest rather than an hour in a city like New York." New York was too populated for either of their likings, too many people, and not enough room to move, not to mention, the city that never slept was full of men. Yuck, the thought made them want to vomit. There weren't enough arrows in the world to poke them full of holes. Moving back to the topic at hand, Zoe squeezed her hands together in front of her. "Is there something special about this place, Milady?" It was special if it caught Artemis' attention. "Honestly, Zoe, it's become one of my favorite places recently." Clapping her hands loudly together, she drew the attention of every hunter at camp, "which is why I would like to make an announcement." It took half a minute before every young girl in the Hunters of Artemis were gathered around the moon goddess. "I know we've only been here a few days, but I'd like to announce we'll be on the move again tomorrow." The announcement made a noticeable impact as the hunter looked at Artemis in surprise. "Are we really, Milady?" One of the hunters from the back row asked. "That's right, Miranda. Are we going on a new hunt?" Another asked, and Artemis identified the person who spoke as Lisa, a member of the hunt for over 200 years. "What are we hunting next, Milady? Is it the Minotaur?" "No. Let's go after the Manticore." "The Manticore, we did that last year. There's no way it's reformed already." "How about a real challenge? Like the Nemean lion?" "Nah. Let's chase after the Tumescian fox. It's been over a century since we last saw it. I say we look for a cyclops. A draken? No. The Hydra. Girls. Girls. Settle down." Artemis laughed, failing from keeping the smile off her face. Their eagerness to chase after monsters and sent them on a one-way trip to Tartarus was admirable. It made her swell with pride at their bravery to face such creatures in combat. "Your eagerness is admirable, but we won't be hunting after anything, at least, not for another week." The faces of her hunters dropped, and some pouted. Even Zoe and Phoebe looked disappointed. "They won't get to slay any monsters." "Oh, then what are we doing?" This time, it was Artemis' turn to hide her excitement. "Well, I thought since it's been a successful year of monster hunting so far, and to celebrate gaining new sisters into the hunt, I would treat you all to the best hot chocolate in the world. I'll even throw in some of those delicious cookies I brought back with me a month ago." The boxes of baked goods the blonde owner had provided her with before Hermes' little prank had gone over famously with her hunters. Even Zoe had been unable to help herself and binged half a dozen cookies within a minute of opening the box. "Really?" Excited chatter broke out amongst the hunters. When their lady treated them, she went all out. They all remembered the box of goodies Artemis had brought back to the camp with her, and how big of a hit they were. "That's right, however, it does mean we'll be heading into the city. The establishment I've been visiting is in the West Village of Manhattan." She noticed the faces of her hunters sour somewhat. Her hunters were not keen on cities, though would push that inside when it came to hunting a monster. "You might feel this is out of the blue, but I hope you come to enjoy this place as much as I do. It provides a warm and safe atmosphere that I'm sure you'll all enjoy." The owner of the Fox's Den is a good person. "Do they make cakes, Milady?" "The best you'll ever taste. My sister, Persephone, and my lord uncle have visited too." Hades left with a smile on his face. The lord of the underworld and ruler of the dead smiled. The ruling thought in all the hunters' minds was how it was even possible. The few that had seen the god of the underworld looked like he never cracked a smile in his life. Before now, they weren't sure he knew how to smile. "Whoa. Whoever this woman is, she must be one accomplished chef to gain such attention. I, for one, am excited. Zoe's words made Artemis smile and nodded at her lieutenant, as she and every other hunter all bowed to Artemis in thanks. So loyal were her hunters, and forever grateful to the kindness she gave them. However, before she could get too excited, she noticed an issue with Zoe's statement. I should clear something up. Artemis waved her hands in front of her, in a nonchalant-like fashion. The owner of the cafe is not a woman. The excitement came to a sudden halt. Not a woman. That's right. But Milady, that would mean, Phoebe asked, before trailing off into silence. Slowly, Artemis nodded and kept a close eye on the facial expressions of each girl. Some were shocked, and others had their jaws hanging from their mouth. Her older hunters, like Zoe and Phoebe, wore expressions of frosty indifference and disgust, and their eyes spoke volumes, despite no words coming out of their mouth. They all had their reasons for their dislike or hatred towards men, but she hoped they were willing to give Naruto a chance as she did. This could take some convincing, she thought, before sighing as chaos erupted within the hunters' camp. Not long now, Naruto thought, his arms crossed against his chest as he looked out through the glass window of the fox's den. The inside of the fox's den was empty apart from himself, with the last customer leaving nearly an hour ago. The closed sign was visible on the door, but the inside spoke the opposite with all the lights still on. Artemis doesn't strike me as someone who shows up late. The auburn-haired woman had been visiting him more often than usual, and the last time she visited, which was 2 days ago, she came to him with a request. Please, keep the fox's den open later than usual, and let me bring my girls with me. I'd like them to try the amazing food. He saw no problem with that and was quick to say yes. He liked the auburn-haired woman, and their chats when she visited never failed to make him smile. In a way, she reminded him a little of himself. She worked tirelessly to make young women feel safe and give them the strength to stare cruelty and abuse in the face and give them an ass kicking. If he could help out and put a smile on their faces for one evening, then he would give it his best shot. Though, she did say not to get my hopes. These girls aren't fond of guys. Her warning rang through his head. What level they hated guys was uncertain, but he had an inkling of an idea. Fond might not be a strong enough word for it. If it was how he was picturing it, then he might have his work cut out for him. Nonsense. Yaru Naruto Uzumaki. You can get through to everyone if you work hard enough. Despite his age and his weariness to the world, he was still a spring chicken at heart. His belief in hard work and possessing the guts to persevere wasn't snuffed out yet. His will of fire was still burning, and thought it wasn't as bright as it once was. He could feel it within himself. His goal was to make these girls smile, and by God, nothing was going to get in his way. As soon as that thought crossed his mind, he regretted it. From the corner of his eye, a figure sat 3 tables down from where he stood. They were dressed head to toe in a dark, almost muddy green robe that churned and shifted and left little skin revealed. The robe swept around the figure's feet and covered their arms down to the tips of their fingers. Not a single feature was visible thanks to a veil made of dust and sand, tucking her hair away from view, but it was clear the figure was that of a woman. Only one feature was visible for him to see. The eyes. You, he thought, looking at her from the corners of his eyes. She took many forms over his lifetime and was quick to recognize her current state. Focusing on his senses and reaching out around the area, he let out an uncharacteristic grunt. You're not here. You're just a figment of my imagination. Clenched at his sides, he felt his fingernails close to breaking the skin of his palm. The figure didn't say anything back to him. Instead, all the woman did was look at him with condescending eyes. From the way the skin shifted and crinkled around her eyes, he knew she was smiling beneath her veil. He could picture it in his head, and it took every ounce of willpower for the old shinobi not to power up a Rasengan and drive it through her form. Leave? I won't ask again. He closed his eyes and took soothing breaths to steady himself. Half a minute later, when he opened his eyes and looked back to the corner of the room, she was gone. A sigh of relief escaped his mouth, and he leaned on the window with forehead resting against his forearm. Thank God. The last thing I need is picturing that woman tonight of all nights. It didn't matter where he went in the world, that woman tended to follow him wherever he went, whether in reality or his mind. Shaking the moment off, he pulled himself together when he sensed a large group of individuals heading straight for him a few blocks over. There were 3 dozen heading towards him, all of whom had connections to nature. They were similar to what he sensed from nymphs, but at the same time, different in the sense that they felt more hostile. Wood nymphs felt to him like peace-wielding hippies, wanting to spread the love for the good of the forest. This group, on the other hand, felt like warriors of the forest, ready to protect it against invaders who sought to harm it with anything pointy they could find. Here they come, he thought, before making any last preparations. I don't like this, Phoebe muttered, walking a step behind Zoe as they led the procession of hunters through the streets of New York. As ordered by Artemis, the hunters had relocated the following morning and set up a new camp in the center of Central Park. The campsite was concealed from mortals with a mist, thanks to the actions of Chelsea, a daughter of Hecate, before leaving their camp. The goddess had ordered them to leave behind their weapons, 1 because she promised them safe travel to the fox's den, and 2, she didn't want any of her livelier hunters to get any ideas concerning their host. Though disappointed, the girls complied, despite how naked they felt without their bows and hunting knives. Even their clothing was different, though the theme was still silver and natural forest colors. The girls looked more like a group of regular young women, instead of monster hunting, semi-immortal huntresses. Zoe made a TSK sound with her mouth, but couldn't help agreeing with her comrade and friend. She wasn't looking forward to being in the presence of some man, even if, according to her leader, he made the best hot chocolate and cake in the world. It was hard for Zoe to believe anyone was that good, much less a mortal man. She would have to see it and taste it to believe such a thing. I'm not looking forward to it either, but this is what Lady Artemis has asked of us. It's a treat for the hunt, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like one. Remind me again why Lady Artemis is meeting us there later. It seemed strange that the goddess of the moon wasn't traveling with them. Often, Artemis had to rein them in where they wanted to get creative when a male walked past them. Then again, the Olympian was responsible for the abundance of jacalops throughout the North American continent. Either way, even without their weapons, the hunters was adept in hand-to-hand combat when needed. It wasn't hard to take down a man. 1 swift kick to the junk was usually all it took. Odds, Phoebe loved kicking guys in the junk. As our lady stated before she left, she will be joining us later with Lady Athena. They had a meeting with Lord Zeus earlier this evening. Zoe eyed Phoebe. You know she can't turn her father down. I guess. Zoe patted her friend on the shoulder and looked behind them to check the rest of the hunt was still following, and none had wandered off. I think we're close, Lady Artemis said. We would know it when we see it. She says it stands out against the other buildings. What does that mean? She shrugged. I have no idea. I guess we'll know once we see it. Are we there yet? No. Zoe looked back and stared at the hunter that spoke. Don't start that again, Tracy. We get there when we get there. Huffing, one of the hunters crossed their arms and pouted. Fine. Walking through the West Village, it didn't take long for them to arrive at their destination. Like Artemis told them earlier, it stood out, but not for the reasons they had imagined. They were picturing some kind of sign with neon lights. They weren't expecting to see a building the brightest shade of orange imaginable, even in the dark. The street lamp did a perfect job as displaying the outside of the building. Oh, gods, please tell me that's not the place we're going to. It was Phoebe who spoke, voicing the sentiments of every girl in the hunt, despite not being typical girly girls. Even they had to gawk at the bold choice of color. Why would someone do such a thing? Zoe wanted to agree, thinking there had to be some kind of mistake. There was no way their Lady Artemis would visit such a place. Alas, when Zoe spied the sign hanging over the doorway, her feelings sank. I fear it is, she muttered, before taking a deep breath and gathering her strength. Come on, let's get this over with. An audible groan resonated from the hunters, but together, they followed their lieutenant. There were few cars in the street that evening, and crossing the road had been a piece of cake for the group of 36 girls. They got strange and curious looks coming from some of the passers-by, but a collective glare from all the girls quickly sent them on their way. The last thing they needed this evening was to be stared at by strange men. They might not have their weapons, but anything pointy, be it a plastic spoon, could be a weapon in their hands. Okay ladies, here we go. Best behavior, Zoe reminded them and pushed the door open. A familiar jingle ran through the air as the warmth of the inside engulfed her. Like many before her, she couldn't help feeling like being cocooned in a blanket. Before long, the familiar aroma of freshly made hot chocolate tickled her nose, only seconds to being inside the fox's den. Zoe Nightshade found herself trying not to unconsciously licking her lips. Behind her, the other hunters all had a similar experience, though some were more vocal than others. Wow. Smell that. That smells heavenly. Maybe this place won't be so bad after all. Look at the tables. The voice prompted all the girls to look as they made their way inside. On every table, multiple cups of hot chocolate were waiting for them, each with a small mound of whipped cream sitting on the surface. A bonus, the girls spied rainbow sprinkles on the whipped cream, along with 2 small pieces of gingerbread sitting on the saucer. If that wasn't enough, in the middle of each table, the tray filled with bite-sized desserts were waiting for them, sitting neatly in rows of 7. One of the hunters stepped forward and looked down at the tray. So cute. She muttered, letting her eyes scan each one. There's so many here. There's carrot cake, red velvet, coconut, Victoria sponge, chocolate, coffee. She stopped at the last one. The last bite-sized cake was cream-colored, with a drizzle of dark amber sauce. Licking her lips, she delicately picked it up and threw it in her mouth, just as Zoe was about to stop her. Why? The hunter groaned out, making the rest of the girls stare at her in surprise. Oh my god. Girls. You have to try these. I've never tasted anything this amazing before, get over here, she ushered them over, and one by one, some of the girls followed suit, they each mimicked her actions, and moments later, the girls all started to gush over the food, the tray, filled with treats, slowly started vanishing as the girls grabbed anything they could get their hands on. The more subdued hunters watched their sisters turn into animals as they reached for the sweet treats, and slowly made their way to the other tables. Zoe led them past, idly ducking out of the way from a stray elbow, trying to appear more civilized than the younger hunters. The experienced hunters split into groups of 4, taking a table between them and took their seats, sitting down. Zoe found herself sitting with Phoebe, Selene, and Amaya. Selene had been with the hunters of nearly 300 years, while Amaya joined barely a century ago. Despite her youth compared to the rest of the table, she was a formidable warrior, working her way up the ladder before becoming one of their best fighters. So, who wants to go first? Phoebe asked, taking her mug of hot chocolate. She could deny it looked and smelled amazing. She didn't want to voice a compliment to something Amela made, but the smell was whetting her appetite, more than the ones Lady Hestia would make them when she visited. Such a thought was ludicrous. The treats and beverages Hestia made for her family were legendary. Perhaps we can all go together? Selene replied, mimicking her senior comrade's actions. It didn't look poisoned, and it sure didn't look like someone has spiked it with something nasty. As someone who sadly had been on the receiving end of the spiked drink back in the day, the huntress would be on her guard if offered something by a member of the other sex. Taking deep breaths, one by one, the 4 women brought their cups to their mouths. They took one last look at each other, before letting the hot drink funnel its way into their systems. The result was instant, as their eyes widened, as if a unicorn farting rainbow and sprinkles from its behind appeared before them. A shocked gasp came out from Phoebe. And Bepho, the robust girl, could realize what she was doing. She was necking the whole drink down her throat. Next to her, Selene and Amaya weren't any better, with Amaya covering the top of her face as she took delicate sips. The dark-haired girl wanted to savor her drink. Selene was in the same boat as Phoebe, with drops of hot chocolate splashing against her silver jacket and leaving a trail down her chin. Beneath the table, Zoe's hand clenched. She hadn't taken another sip, but her body wanted nothing more than to take another swig. She didn't want to praise a man, much less a mortal man. Gods, it tasted so good. The other tables were in similar states, while the younger hunters on the other side of the room had moved from one table to another, picking away at the tray of mini cakes. Speaking of the mini cakes, Zoe's gaze traveled to the tray sat in the middle of the table. For the lieutenant of the hunt, her gaze drifted to the coconut cakes. Only a handful of people were aware of her weakness to anything remotely coconut flavored. To her, nothing could beat the taste, and had long conversations with her patron during the evening when it was only the 2 of them sitting around the campfire. If she could, she would lather every item of food with coconut. In her mind, it made everything all the sweeter. It was perhaps the only thing from her father she was proud to inherit. Gulping hard, the other girls watched as Zoe reached out and plucked one of the coconut-flavored mini cakes from the tray. She brought it up to her face, looking it over to make sure nothing looked like it didn't belong. It wasn't only drinks that could get spiked. A moment passed, and the veteran hunter decided to bite the bullet, taking one delicate bite. The others watched as her mouth went into action and chewed on the sweet treat. Within moments, an explosion of coconut ran rampant over her tastibids, forcing the huntress to slump in her chair. Everyone in the room looked at her. Her expression started to morph, and the girls watched as their lieutenant internally tried to fight against expressing a look of pure joy. In the struggle, her face contorted into a look one related with when sat on the toilet. I thought I heard people out here. The room stopped what they were doing and turned to the swinging door behind the counter, carrying a large tray of freshly baked cookies, which the girls all noticed and unconsciously licked their lips over. The blonde appeared from the kitchen with his usual smile. You must be Artemis girls. He tried not to laugh when he saw their faces. Not one of them didn't have crumbs or chocolate staining their faces. Ignoring the overload of goodness, Zoe swallowed her coconut mini cake and changed the expression on her face. She won't let this man see how much she enjoyed the sweet treat. A mask of frosty indifference returned to her face, one that was mimicked by the rest of the hunters. They took in the man's appearance, and couldn't help noticing how much like a child of Apollo he looked. Phoebe, in particular, leveled him with a frostier glare. Despite being a child of Apollo, Phoebe held no love for her demigod and godly siblings. Lady Artemis told us he wasn't a demigod, but still, Zoe thought, straightening her back as the man walked around the counter, he carries the features of a spawn of the sun. Their eyes briefly followed the tray of cookies as he put them down on the counter and leveled them all with a bright smile. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Artemis has told me a lot about you girls, and I was pleased to hear she was bringing you all to visit. His eyes traveled across the room, appearing to Zoe that he was searching for someone. Speaking of Artemis, where is she? I thought she was bringing you all here. Seeing his confusion, Zoe broke the frosty silence that hung over the hunters. Lad Miss Artemis, she corrected herself, remembering her lady informing her of the story he created for the mortal. Will be joining us later. She had family matters to attend to first. She will be arriving later on with La Miss Athena. His mouth formed an O shape, but nodded nonetheless. He walked across the room, weaving his way past the tables, until he stood in front of the tables Zoe sat around. He looked at Zoe, his eyes running over her, and tilted his head when the huntress narrowed her eyes at him and felt her sisters level him with frostier glares than before. Though her weapons were back at the camp, she was already visualizing what she could use to batter the blonde's face. She had a couple of options: the mug, the tray the cakes were on, her chair. She could flip the chair over with her foot and break one of the legs off. He wouldn't see it coming, maybe in the eye. Or the chest. Plenty of options, she thought. His fingers clicked and pointed at her. You must be Zoe. She blinked in surprise. I said you must be Zoe. You look how Artemis described, and I can't help noticing the air of authority you have compared to the rest of the girls, he replied, his smile widening and showing the whites of his teeth. She said you're the one and she puts in charge when she isn't around, and I can see why. Your guidance counselor has nothing but positive things to say about you. Silently, Zoe nodded, though was thinking, Lady Artemis talks about me. With this man. She talks about all of you, he revealed, slowly melting the icy visages of the young women. Every time she visits, our conversations always turn to you girls. This one time, she spoke about you all for nearly 30 minutes, talking about a trip to Yellowstone you all went on. Her smile was so wide I could have fit an entire cake in there, just like a proud mama bear, and you're all her cubs. It's sweet to listen to. He looked across the room and watched a couple of smiles twitch to life. Lady Artemis talks about all of us. They always knew Lady Artemis cared for them, but to hear from this mortal man that she spoke about them so frequently to him warmed their hearts. Despite the kindness and guidance that Artemis showed them, the knowledge that they were more than her wards and followers often slipped their minds. When Artemis took them in, she was taking them in as her children and showing them how to survive in the wilds of the world. Before she came along, none of them would have lasted a week without her training. Sometimes they forgot they were more than her followers. Artemis adopted them and took them in as her children. She took them out of their pain lives before the hunt and gave them a place to belong. It was a debt they could never pay off. As the blonde spoke, one hunter, in particular, caught his attention. She stared at him, her dark eyes never leaving his face, and it took him a moment to realize she was focusing on his lips. Thinking back on his conversations with Artemis, a tidbit of information had slipped through the crack. Ah, I see. Keeping his smile in place, he took the tray of cookies and placed them on Zoe's table. I finished baking these 5 minutes before you arrived. He made a motion with his hand, ushering the girls to take a handful each. Don't be shy, get them while they're still warm. I promise they won't disappoint. To prove his point, he took a bite from one and let out a low hum of his own when he tasted the chocolate chips, half melted from the heat. It was enough to get some of the girls moving, while others slowly followed after. A myriad of hands appeared on the table, some took one, while others took a handful. Overall, the cookies ended up being a big hit, and the blonde felt elated at how happy they looked. Zoe didn't move immediately, though a hand slowly crept forward and took one from the tray. Her eyes narrowed. What's his game? Why is he acting so nice? Next to her, it was clear on Phoebe's face despite his earlier words, she wasn't buying what he was offering. Her expression remained an icy visage. Are you okay? Zoe asked, leaning in to whisper in Phoebe's ear. I'm fine, she replied, though it sounded like a grunt, gazing down to her hands. Zoe noticed the strain Phoebe was putting on the arm of the chair and could hear the creak coming from the wood. Out of all the women in Artemis Hunt, it was safe to say Phoebe's hatred towards men went above and beyond even her own, despite the roles that men played in the world. The red-haired daughter of Apollo couldn't see them as anything more than a plague that she wished could be snuffed out. Phoebe's past was marred in trauma and pain, inflicted on her by men she thought she could trust. Few in the hunt were made aware of her story, which including herself, Apollo, Artemis, and Selene. She suspected some of the other gods of Olympus were aware, but few ever dared to visit the hunt. When around men, Phoebe's whole personality closed up, and in its place was a woman who would sooner shove a knife through the eye of the man in front of her. Zoe, at times, could be civil when asked. We don't have to stay long. Once Lady Artemis returns, we can return to the camp separately if need be. All she got back was a grunt. Her old friend was not in the mood to talk. Taking her eyes away from Phoebe, she looked around the room. Despite her worries, the man had yet to try anything funny, though that didn't mean she would be taking it easy on him. He may have gained Lady Artemis' trust, as crazy as that appeared, but that didn't mean had earned hers. She watched him slip away into the back and this time bring out another tray. This one filled with puff pastries with some kind of chocolate twisting through the dough. It quickly gained the attention of the hunters, and like before, her sisters surrounded the tray and made a grab for the beautiful looking delicacies. As much as hate to think it, they do look delicious. There is no harm in taking one, she thought, leaning in and taking one into her hand. Unconsciously, She licked her lips and brought it up to her mouth, but stopped when Naruto moved to face Amaya, judging by Amaya's expression. She wasn't expecting the blonde to turn his attention on her and watched as the black-haired girl leaned back in her chair when Naruto crouched down in front of her. To Zoe's and Amaya's surprise, Naruto placed a tray of puff pastries on the other table and started moving his hands. "If it's easier for you, I can communicate with you this way. I could see you were paying attention to my mouth." The surprise was evident on everyone's face, though none were more evident than the reaction on Amaya's face. After a moment of stunned silence, Amaya followed Naruto's lead. "You can speak American Sign Language?" The blonde shinobi nodded. "I can, and we can speak this way if you have any questions you'd like to ask me, or if you have any requests. Requests? Do you have any desserts or drinks you like? I can even make breakfast food if that's what you'd like," he signed, inwardly smiling when she saw her tense shoulders starting to relax. She looked skeptical at his statement. Was this true? "Anything?" "Again," he nodded. "Anything?" The young huntress thought for a moment before answering. "Cinnamon buns." The blonde shinobi nearly felt his knees give out when he saw the hopeful look on her face. The expression reminded him so much of Hinata that he blinked 3 times before letting out a laugh. Cinnamon buns were his late wife's favorite food in the world, no matter what he made for her. Cinnamon for Hinata was ramen for Naruto, it beloved to her core. The action confused Amaya, who signed her confusion. "What's so funny?" "Nothing," he signed, though a few chuckles escaped his lips. "Nothing at all. I'm very familiar with cinnamon buns. I'll bring you a fresh batch from the back." The girl tilted her head. "Won't that take all evening?" she asked. She wasn't familiar with making the sweet treats, but she was aware of the time it took to make. He waved her question off. "I've always got stuff prepared, so don't you worry about a thing. Y'all be up to your eyeballs in cinnamon buns if that's what you want. I swear father holds those pointless meetings with us just to spend time with us," Artemis muttered, her face stuck in a pout the moment she and Athena exited their father's temple on Olympus. Within the first 5 minutes of the meeting, Artemis could tell it was one that didn't need to happen. Her father was complicated at best, and while she loved him as a daughter should, he could be unbearable when he was bored. The meeting went from the pair providing him with their monthly updates into a ramble about pointless things, which escalated into watching a movie in his theater room. Next to the moon goddess and dressed in mortal attire, the goddess of wisdom could only hum in agreement. It's how he always been. To say Zeus treated his daughters differently compared to his sons was obvious, even to a deaf and blind man. When it came to his sons, Zeus acted as the strict parent who laid out the rules of his household on a marble tablet and expected those present to follow them. In fairness to the king of the gods, his Olympian sons didn't make life easy, nor were they the type to follow the rules expectantly. Ares was a bloodthirsty bully who started needless wars. Apollo was a slacker who seduced mortal women to his bed most nights. Though Zeus wasn't innocent in that category by a long shot, Hermes, though a hard worker, had a streak as a joker that often got him into trouble. Dionysus was a useless drunk who didn't deserve his godhood 364 days of the year. The only son that rarely gave him trouble was Hephaestus, who was a shut-in and a hermit. The only time they saw the god of the forge was during the summer and winter solstice. To see him outside of those meetings was a rarity. Athena recognized her father needed to be hard on them. If he didn't, they would walk all over him. Artemis and Athena, however, he scarcely had to discipline them and bring the hammer down. Athena and Artemis, in Zeus' eyes, were still his little girls, despite Artemis being 4593 years old and Athena nearing 4700 years old. The two goddesses had spent centuries being gushed over by their father, and admittedly they used that to their advantage to get what they wanted. However, in return, they had to tolerate Zeus' constant doting. Having the king of the gods wrapped around their pinky fingers had its benefits, but it also had its consequences. It's over now, and he likely knocking on Hera's doors trying to find his way back into their marriage bed, Artemis quipped, though knowing her stepmother and aunt, she would inevitably let him inside. Now we get to reap the rewards for the night. As long as your huntresses haven't burned the place down yet, I'm waiting for the scent of smoke to tickle my nose and the fire engines to pass by. My girls would never do such a thing. Artemis replied, I told them how great the Fox's Den is, and how Naruto is one of the few good men in the world. I have the utmost trust in my lieutenant to keep the girls in line while I'm absent. A single eyebrow rose on Athena's face, turning her head to look at her younger sister. It's her I would be worried about the most. Zoe has her moments, but her patience and tolerance towards men have increased over the years. Really? The same Zoe Nightshade that killed a squad of Roman soldiers for cutting down a couple of trees days before the Battle of Abritus. Those trees were the homes of some nymphs friends of ours, and the soldiers were disrespectful to the forest. The same Zoe Nightshade that kicked a demigod off the white cliffs of Dover back in the 1500s. He was shouting and was drunk, not to mention, he hurt animals for fun, and that's a big no-no in my book. The same Zoe Nightshade that cut off a man's ear for enjoying a hot dog too loudly back in the 70s. Artemis went to speak, but instead, slumped her shoulders. I was hoping you might forget about that one. The goddess of wisdom, dear sister, I don't forget anything. Holding up her hands, the moon goddess pouted, okay, I'll admit, Zoe's temper still gets the better of her from time to time, however, tonight I have the utmost faith in her, I know she won't let me down. Laughing, Athena patted Artemis on the shoulder, I'll take your word for it, sister, I've been waiting for this all day. You and me both. Walking along the sparsely crowded streets of West Village, the two Olympians had memorized the quickest route to the fox's den. As they made small talk, a couple of minutes later, the familiar orange frame of the building came into view, and both hastily stepped up their footsteps. Well, I don't smell any smoke and nothing's on fire, I guess your lieutenant was able to hold to her word, Athena muttered and snorted when her younger sister blew a raspberry her way like a child. I told you so, she replied, and threw the door open. Come on, there's cake in here with my name on it. As always, the scent of coffee and pastries tickled their senses. This time, however, the delightful aroma was followed by the sounds of music and laughter across the room. Your arms need to be more relaxed. They heard from across the room. The two Olympian sisters found themselves look upon a sight neither expected. Even Artemis, who was confident her hunters would enjoy the friendly atmosphere of the fox's den, couldn't do anything but gawk at the picture in front of her. In front of her, the newest members of the hunt, which included Eloise, Tracy, Lyanna, Amanda, Lucy and Maya stood in a line up with the tall blonde owner and proceeded to show him a dance routine the six had been working on in their spare time. All six girls were giggling and smiling as Naruto tried to mimic their movements, moving his hips in conjunction with his arms in the opposite direction. What did you call this again? She heard him asked, his face a mask of concentration as he tried to get the movements right, flashing. Flossing. We came up with it weeks ago, and we're turning it into a thing. A thing? What do you mean? The blonde shinobi bit his lip with the two goddesses, hearing him mutter a curse underneath his breath as his hips fell out of sync once more with his arms. You know, like a trend, we're going to put in on the interwebs. The internet, Lucy. Yeah, that. I'd prefer if you didn't do that, girls, Artemis announced, making herself known along with Athena. We've got more important things to do than making dance videos for the World Wide Web. Milady. Zoe announced, moving from her seat and bowing to her patron goddess. She seemed to forget they were present with a mortal, but the last 20 minutes had baffled Zoe's brain. She had never witnessed members of the hunt having fun with a male before. So, I see everyone's having fun, Artemis replied, and couldn't stop the smile when over half of the hunt cheered out their thanks. Looking across the room, Artemis was pleased to see it wasn't just her newest members that embraced the fox's den, and the owner. Many of the girls were wearing smiles and cracking jokes with each other, enjoying the atmosphere and treats that came with it. As she expected, the blonde mortal had managed to make an impact on the hunters the way she hoped. I was wondering when you were going to show up, Naruto welcomed, walking over and scratching the back of his head as he smiled at the pair. It's nice to see you again, Athena. The same to you, Naruto. Athena smiled and looked around the room. I don't need to ask how things are going, I see. Nope, everything's going great. He ushered them over and gave them 2 menus. There's not much left of what I made your girls, Artemis. These girls are like bottomless pits. There's no end to their appetites. I guess they take after their guidance counselor then, she quipped back, half teasing and smirking. She expected no less from her girls, taking the seat next to Zoe and Athena sitting in a chair brought over by Naruto. The blonde was about to write down their order when the 6 dancing hunters grabbed his arm. Come on, Mr. Naruto, we've still got some routines to show you, Eloise told him, guiding him back to the makeshift dance floor. Amused by their actions, Artemis leaned back in her chair when she found Zoe holding out a napkin with cookies wrapped up in them. Zoe. I managed to grab some before the girls devoured them all, Zoe said quietly, before handing another napkin to the goddess of wisdom, hiding them in her pockets. The girls were none the wiser they missed a couple. Taking them, Artemis smiled and clapped Zoe's shoulder. Thank you, Zoe, once again, you prove that I can always count on you. Athena replied in kind with a small nod in her direction. Thank you, Zoe. You are welcome, Lady Artemis, Lady Athena. It seems everything is agreeable. The younger Olympian asked, taking a bite out of a cookie and watching her lieutenant closely. As expected, Zoe's face was a myriad of emotions, but she appeared to be more relaxed about it. While Zoe would never be rude towards her temper had been shorter with the other hunters, resulting in a stricter regiment for the recruits. This place is nice enough, and the man that runs it. She took longer to reply as if trying to choose her words delicately. Has not been terrible. In hunter terms, Artemis might as well put a gold star next to the blonde's name. I'm glad to hear that. She leaned back in her hair, watching from the corner of her eye as her youngest hunters continued to show another dance routine to the struggling owner. It appeared dancing was not one of his many talents. I know we have strict rules when it comes to men, but he is one of the good ones. If he was like the rest, then I wouldn't bring you within a 100-mile radius of this place. I understand, Milady. Well, I was not keen to be here here tonight, the man has made an effort with facilitating us, despite unaware of our true identities." Artemis took another bite from her cookie, as did Athena, who slumped in her chair from the delicious taste. "If he can make an effort for Amaya and speak to her in her preferred tongue, then I deem him worthy of a single chance." Artemis' eyes widened marginally and turned to face Amaya, who quietly ate away at her plate of cinnamon buns. When feeling the moon goddess's eyes on her, Amaya turned to face her, Melody. Like Naruto, Artemis started speaking to Amaya in American Sign Language. "He spoke to you in sign." Some would have called her crazy for accepting a deaf girl into the Hunters of Artemis, asking how could she teach a girl to hunt monsters when she couldn't use her sense of hearing or how to communicate with her. Artemis has shrugged away their questions and saw Amaya's introduction into the hunt as a way to challenge herself. Unlike some of her other immortal siblings, Artemis would try to improve herself, and meeting Amaya gave a chance to work on that. She went to Athena, and her highly intelligent sister taught her how to speak in sign language to Amaya, and thus taught other members of the hunt the same once she was proficient enough. Sign language became a mandatory skill for the hunters to learn, not only for Amaya, but for any girl they came across that sought out her aid. Amaya nodded. He did. It was surprising, though not unwelcomed. Her smile was enough for Artemis to give one back in kind. "You like him?" "I do, and Hess is not like the others." Amaya looked thoughtful before signing. "He has a good heart, but sad eyes." "Sad eyes?" "Like someone who's known hardship, someone who knows loss." The dark-haired girl nibbled on a cinnamon bun before adding, "Someone like us." "I see." Artemis recalled a conversation she had with Persephone some weeks ago. Her elder sister and queen of the underworld gushed about her time at the fox's den with a blonde man. The conversation naturally turned to Naruto, and the goddess of spring had let slip that he was once married and that his wife had passed away some time ago. Unlike her normal feelings on the matter of marriage, the Olympian felt sympathy for the man. She wondered if that was what Amaya meant. She had always been good at reading people by their expressions alone. Looking around the room, Artemis returned to speech. "I can't help but notice there are 2 fewer hunters than there should be." She looked back at Zoe. "Where are Phoebe and Selen?" The frown marred Zoe's face. "Phoebe had enough for one evening and returned to the camp. I don't think this place is to her liking." Zoe made a motion with her head in the direction of Naruto, and Artemis was silently understood and released a sigh. "I didn't want her going alone, so I had Selen go with her." Phoebe scarcely said a word all night. "I had hoped she would give more of an effort, but I should have expected this." "It's not your fault, Melody." "Perhaps." She pinched her brow. "That girl can be as stubborn as her father, as much as she doesn't want to admit it." Out of all of her hunters, Phoebe was the one Artemis felt had the most pent-up frustration when it came to the other sex. Zoe's temper towards men was one thing, but Phoebe's was on a level that made even her worry. While Artemis could admit that some men were worth their respect and kindness, as well as Zoe to an extent, Phoebe firmly believed in the opposite. Her hatred was rooted deep, core and stem. She had hoped that meeting Naruto might alter her thinking. But that was wishful thinking on her part. Taking a deep breath, Artemis smiled at her girls. Under the watchful eye of her elder sister across the table, "Perhaps another time then, I'll have one-on-one time with Phoebe later and see how she's feeling." "Of course, Melody." Laughter broke out across the room, and the sister Olympians had to snort when they saw Naruto finally get the hang of the dance moves the girls were showing him. "I think I'm starting to get the hang of this," he announced, wiggling his hips from side to side as his arms went in the opposite direction. The girls around him clapped while giggling at how silly he looked. "Looking good, Mr. Naruto." "It's a good look. Perhaps you should change careers," Artemis asked teasingly, a smirk gracing her face. Across the table, Athena sat and stared at her sister, watching the interaction between the mortal and Olympian. It had been a while she visited the fox's den together with Artemis, and she was surprised at how familiar the pair had become with one another. The goddess of wisdom scarcely remembered the last time she acted normal towards a male mortal. "How curious. And who would feed that bottomless pit you call a stomach?" He countered. "To think, I went to all the trouble of making a salted caramel chocolate cake just for you. I guess it will have to go to waste, or maybe the girls would all like to share it between themselves." The giggle ran through the room, with even Athena smiling in good humor as Artemis' eye widened. "You've had that in the back room all this time, and you've let me sit here none the wiser." The blonde shrugged, irking the auburn-haired goddess even more. "Go and bring it out here, right now." I didn't hear a please in that sentence. "You don't deserve one." "Maybe I should keep it for myself and eat it in front of you." "Maybe I should rearrange your face." Athena snorted, but sat back and watched the back and forth with content and amusement. Next to her, Zoe and the older hunters cold believed the way their patron and leader was acting, and how casually she was treating the male mortal. It was bizarre to see, but not unwelcomed for many of the girls to experience. For many of them, while they understood they had to keep men at a distance as per the rules, it was nice to see their leader casually interacting with one. Many of them didn't think all men were bad, though their time before the hunt was marred by experiences with the awful ones. Seeing the goddess of the moon befriending one of those good ones, it gave some of them hope that maybe friendships with boys were possible. Amidst a positive attitude that ran through the fox's den, the blue eyes belonging to Naruto Uzumaki repeatedly flickered to the corner of the room. He gave nothing away, continuing his comedic back and forth with Artemis, trying to ignore the reappearing woman in the background staring at him with condescending eyes. She wasn't here, but she won't leave him alone. Whenever things started going well for him, she would appear and remind him of everything he lost. He stayed calm, but the words reverberated through his mind like a ripple on the surface of a lake. Get out of my head. Where are you going? Melinoe heard, her face pointing in the direction that led towards Elysium. The souls that came to the underworld divided into 3 sections, with Elysium, the fields of asphodel and the fields of punishment, stationed next to one another like 3 separate islands. Elysium consisted of a valley surrounded by walls, a gated community from which one could hear laughter and the smell of barbecue. The path that led towards Elysium was a golden brick road that started from the Judgment Pavilion and ran through the center of the underworld. On the left was a black brick road that led to the fields of punishment, and to the right was a red brick road that led to the fields of asphodel. All souls had to go down one of these roads, but for today, the only one she was interested in was the one that led to mortal paradise. Ever since she visited the fox's den with her father and met Naruto Uzumaki, the blonde mortal had been on her mind night and day, not in the romantic sense, but in the sense that he was a puzzle that needed solving. His feelings and connections toward several souls that resided deep within Elysium was something she couldn't shake, and she needed to find out what was going on. She never felt threads connected to souls as old as the ones he possessed. No other mortal in the world had anything close, and it only deepened the mystery, what made him special. Her father had no idea she was here, and neither did Thanatos. However, despite their absence, the womanly voice behind her had been expected. Turning around, the goddess of ghosts did not appear surprised when a set of vivid green eyes, reminiscent of Greek fire, stared at her in idle curiosity. Hecate was one of the most bizarre goddesses within the Greek pantheon, and one of the few that had been around longer than her father and the other elder Olympians, while technically born a titan. She was an integral part of the system that ran the world, and the one that created and maintained the barrier that kept their world and the mortal world separate. Without her witchcraft in the mist, the world would look very different from the one they knew. Dressed in a chiton of green silk to match her eyes and dark hair cut into a bob, the goddess of witchcraft stared at her, waiting for an answer. I have a matter I need to attend to in Elysium. It's nothing serious, but it's something I would like to finish off sooner rather than later. The answer wasn't enough to satisfy the older goddess, who took one step closer to the daughter of the Dark One. Is your father aware of this matter? She asked with her face a mask void of emotions. Melinoe thought she was good at appearing expressionless, but Hecate practically invented the look. You know he does not approve of any god or goddess entering one of the fields without his knowledge. He gets moodier than normal when someone goes behind his back within his domain. It's not as bad as his brothers, but it's still quite terrifying. As someone who could move between the domains of the big 3, the goddess of magic was well versed with how each son of the Titan King ran their respective kingdoms and domains. The one thing they all had in common was their tempers. When it came to people going behind their back, it was a headache for all involved. Be docent, it's a matter not worth father's time. I don't want to bother him with something as meaningless as this, she replied, trying to dampen Hecate's curiosity. It won't take long. What does it involve? Hecate replied. Just stuff involving a silly little mortal, that's all. I think one might be trying to escape from Elysium? Why would any mortal soul be trying to escape from Elysium? Why do mortals try and do anything these days? They are so bizarre to understand in the modern world. They are nothing like they used to be back in the older days, back in the time of swords and sandals. The goddess of magic didn't refute her claims. Mortals in recent years were very different from the ones that used to populate the earth. For instance, few believed in magic these days, resulting in a vast majority of the world's population to forget about her very existence. Most don't even know her name anymore. Only a loyal following of Wiccans, or one of modern witches as she called them, understood her importance in the world. The followers of Hecate ran all through the world centuries ago. But with the rise of the church and magic labeled as the work of the devil, magic was little more than a tool for fictional stories and the big screen movies. The Salem witch trials back in 1692 and 1693 didn't help either. Oh, and don't even get her started on those silly books from England. Hecate had some choice words for those books. The goddess tilted her head, observing the younger goddess with keen eyes. True enough, however, it must be more than that if the goddess of ghosts has seen to it personally. Won't this be a job more suited for Thanatos? It feels like a small-time problems Hess better off solving. The god of death was notorious when it came to dead souls trying to find a way to escape the chains of the underworld. He often had dealings with souls trying to escape the fields of punishment and the fields of asphodel. But she couldn't recall the son of Nyx dealing with a soul trying to escape from Elysium. It was unusual. Melinoe huffed and couldn't help but wonder why was Hecate making this harder than needed. Normally, she won't care for such things. Hecate is like a lone wolf compared to the other gods. She does what she wants in her own time. Hecate didn't show any interest in much outside of what she deemed worthy or necessary. Her friendship with her parents allowed Melinoe to understand what the goddess was like and what it took to hold her attention. The mystery revolving around Naruto Uzumaki was one she wanted to solve on her own, hence the reason she had not informed her father. If she told Hecate, she feared the information would undoubtedly end up back with Hades, given Hecate's position within Hades' small but trusted inner circle. There's no need, as I said, I can handle it, it won't take long. The goddess of magic crossed her arms, perhaps I can accompany you then, and watch you at work. Melinoe shook her head, your offer is kind, but there is no need. I can't help but feel like you are trying to get rid of me, Melinoe. I would never, Melinoe feigned surprise, the task at hand is simply not one that requires the attention of two goddesses. I can be the judge of that. Frowning, Melinoe inwardly sighed and resorted to a tactic she hated having to use, anti-Hecate, don't you trust me? She stuck her lip out and widened her eyes in a way that made her look like a puppy. Gods, this was embarrassing. Hecate didn't say anything straight away, but when she did, her face gained a disapproving edge. Odds, Melinoe, have some self-respect to lower yourself to such tactics, for shame. What? Before the goddess of ghosts could get another word out, Hecate threw up her hands. Alright, if you don't want to tell me what's going on, then I'll leave it alone. You better know what you're doing though. You know how your father gets when other gods mess around in his domain. I don't need to remind you about the syrup incident back in the 1950s, do I? It took 2 weeks to clean up, and to this day Styx will take shots as Hermes when he passes by. Hades was in a mood for months, and a pain in my ass. Hecate let out an uncharacteristic cough while crossing her arms. How Persephone put up with him I'll never know. This won't be like the syrup incident, I swear, she wasn't an idiot like her Olympian uncles. Hecate gave the younger goddess one final look before disappearing in a haze of smoke, leaving Melinoe alone once again. Finally, Melinoe muttered. She thought the goddess of magic was never going to leave. Gathering her bearings, Melinoe took a deep breath and started along the golden brick path, a firm expression on her face, beginning the investigation on the man known as Naruto Uzumaki. At the same time as Melinoe making her way to Elysium, the blonde shinobi was displaying another side of him the goddesses had yet to see. Wo's a cutie. Wo's a cutie. Is it you? I think it is. I think it is you. Naruto babbled, making funny faces and waving his hands in the air to entertain the little girl who sat in her mother's lap. The little girl kept looking his way when he passed the table, and it didn't take long for his attention to turn her way. She was such a cute baby. Blowing a raspberry at her, it didn't take long for the girl to fall into a fit of giggles, making babbling noises of her own, much to the blonde's delight and the mother's amusement. Clapping his hands in rhythm, the little girl copied his actions, her smile wide enough to show off her baby teeth. You're such a happy baby, aren't you? Yes, you are. Oh, that's such a lovely smile you have. It is, isn't it, the mother said, cradling her baby close and kissing the top of the head. She likes you, she gets fussy when she meets new people, but she seems to have taken to you immediately. You have a way with kids. It was the middle of the Friday afternoon, and he was quick to notice it was quieter than it usually was. Then again, the weather over the past couple of days had been awful, with nothing but gray clouds, rain and the odd thunderstorm hitting the residents of New York. It was strange to see such a sudden change in the weather. 1 week prior, the sun had been out, and it was warm enough that Naruto hadn't needed to wear a coat. The woman he was serving walking in 15 minutes ago, bringing along the little sweetheart in her pushchair. The pulse coming from the little girl had caught his eye the moment she came inside with her mother. It was faint given her age, but he could feel the aura coming off her. It was the first one he sensed near himself since his arrival in New York. The demigod, he thought to himself, haven't met one of them in a few decades. Walking back over to the counter, he brought over a plate with a croissant sitting in the middle. Sitting on the side was a pot of jam and a dab of butter. He meant to bring it over moments earlier, but he got distracted by his new little friend, though the mother didn't seem to mind. Crouching to his knees, he started chuckling as he gently played with the little girl's hands when she reached out for him. I don't know about that. I think it's just a sign that she's going to be a very social person when she's older. He poked his tongue out at her and laughed harder when she copied him. I bet you're going to be a cheeky one too. Don't I know it? What her name? If you don't mind me asking. The young woman smiled. I don't mind, the other replied, gently bouncing the baby on one knee. This is Clarice, and I'm Aline LaRue. It's nice to meet you. He looked back at Clarice. Clarice, huh? That's a beautiful name. Both your names are French, right? Aline nodded. That's right. I named her after my grandmother, who was born in France, but moved to the United States in the 1940s, after World War II ended after meeting my grandfather. You don't say? It sounds like there's a story there. The woman hummed and gently placed Clarice back in the high chair Naruto set up for them when they first arrived. She started buttering her croissant when she continued. He was a soldier you see, Jonathan Tracy, originally from the state of Arizona, and signed up to do his part when he was 20. He was part of the forces that dropped on the bays of Normandy, part of the second wave of troops that made their way up the beaches. He always told us it was a miracle he survived, but had lost some good friends that day. That day stayed with him until he passed a few years back. The blonde gained a look of sympathy. I'm sorry to hear that. He hadn't been there on a day, But he remembered seeing the aftermath of the Normandy landings. The world was a strange place, but after the Fourth Shinobi War had ended, Naruto believed he would never see war again in his lifetime. Looking back on it now, and looking at his situation, the number of wars taken place during his lifetime was countless. The unimaginable loss of innocent life from each war could populate the planet threefold. Even now, after all these years, humanity still hadn't managed to make peace with itself and abandon the concept of war for good. Was peace achievable? Because he didn't know anymore. And they meet after the war. The lion shook her head. During the war, my grandmother was a nurse working with the French resistance. She met my grandfather after he got hit by a piece of shrapnel from a destroyed German panzer tank. It was this big and went straight through the abdomen. She held her hands out, and the space between was roughly the same length as the knife she was using. She tended to him and stayed with him until they could move him. After that, they were joined at the hip until he died. He even took her surname when they married. Naruto smiled. It sounds like a cliché movie romance. In a way. And then you named your daughter after her. I did. What did your partner have to say? He asked. Oh, Aline wiped her mouth, rubbing away a piece of jam from the corner of her lip. He didn't say anything. Hess not in the picture. I see, I'm sorry to hear that. Aunt B, it is what it is. The brown-haired woman shrugged. She didn't appear overly upset that her child's father wasn't in the picture. Then again, Clarice was a happy and healthy baby. If their meeting was any indication, showing that Aline was doing a good job raising her daughter, she appeared to be a well-put-together woman and was taking her role as a mom seriously. There were plenty of women who sadly didn't take that role seriously in the modern world, but it was good to see Aline was not one of them. Becoming a mom was a surprise, but since Clarice came into my life, it was like a missing piece of a puzzle I didn't know existed was completed. You know what I mean? Yeah, I do. He knew that feeling all too well. When Hinata told him she was pregnant with Boruto, had scarcely believed it. He was in the middle of a bowl of ramen and promptly ended up choking on his noodles. He fell into a coughing fit afterwards for 5 minutes before gaining his bearings and turned to his wife. He remembered a lot of tears from both of them, which were followed by smiles and laughter. Afterwards, he picked Hinata up and spun her around their living room, eliciting a squeak of surprise from Hinata. All their friends had been delighted for them. Choji, Ino and Kiba even started to cry, though the latter vehemently denied the accusation. Telling Hiashia had been nerve-wracking. Things between them were on good ground, but the blonde remembered what Hiashi was like during their childhood, and old habits didn't disappear quickly. He needn't have been worried. The elder Hyuga embraced his daughter with tears of happiness in his eyes, before following it up by embracing Naruto. He never saw Hiashi happier than the day they told him he was going to be grandfather, a role he lived for when Boruto and Himawari were born. And then the day came when Boruto was born, and he could say with his hand on his heart, he was never more nervous than that night. They were in bed when Hinata's water had broke. He nearly took the front door off when they headed for the hospital. When they arrived, had been in a panic, while Hinata was as cool as a cucumber. She was the one keeping him calm throughout the ordeal, which was a testament to her strength. There is no need to panic. We've spent 9 months preparing for this moment. We've got this. Her word rang through his mind. She's been right, as always, and suffice to say, Hinata kicked childbirth's ass. Even Shizune, who had been present at hundreds, if not thousands of births, complimented Hinata on how she handled it. All he could do was stand by her side, take her hand and lend his strength to his wife. Boruto's birth had taken nearly 6 hours. But the moment he arrived and Shizune placed him in Hinata's arms, it was like the world stood still. He was tiny. Little tufts of blonde hair sat atop his head, showing everyone his lungs were working as they should be. They both cried, and before long, Hinata passed their son over to him. Despite practicing with a watermelon for months, Naruto still felt unready as their son sat in his arms, maneuvering his arms into the correct position. Then, as if feeling his father's insecurities, Boruto opened his tiny eyes, revealing a stunning set of blue eyes brighter than his own. At that moment, it felt like his body lifted from the earth. It could be different for other people, but for Naruto, that moment it was as if his reason for existing was to co-create this precious life sitting in his arms. Like his sole purpose in the world wasn't to be the Hokage of the Hidden Leaf Village, nor was it to be the person who ended the Fourth Shinobi War. It was to be the father of this little boy. He wondered if this was how his parents felt the moment he was born. When Himawari was born, it was a similar feeling. His little girl had been the apple of his eye, and so much like his darling wife, she was always helping everyone and taking care of them. Looking at Clarice and playing with a little girl, he couldn't help but think back to all the times he played with her when she was that age. Are you okay? Blinking in surprise, he looked up at Aline. She was looking at him in concern. You're crying. I am what? Bringing his hand up to his face, he found the woman to be correct and felt the wet patches around his eyes and his skin stretching in the corner of his eyes. I didn't even notice. When did that start to happen? He was so wrapped up in the memories of his children that he didn't notice his emotions beginning to get the better of him. Grabbing one of the unused napkins on the table, he turned away and dabbed his eyes. I am fine, he replied. I don't know what came over me. how unprofessional of me. The line shook her head, and her expression bore no ill will. Don't be, it's not my place to ask what caused this, but I hope you're okay. Not wanting the attention, Naruto waved it off. I'm fine, I'm not sure what that was, but I'm okay. To his relief, a table off in the corner was trying to get his attention and provided a much needed distraction. If y'all excuse me, he glanced down at Clarice and gave the little girl one last smile and raspberry before making his way across the room. Of course, Aline watched him go, her dark eyes following his back as he wove his way past the tables. She wouldn't pry, but she didn't believe it was nothing. Feeling Clarice beginning to fuss, she looked down and cooled herself from smiling when she saw Clarice reaching out to him, a pouty expression on her face. Her daughter was taken with a blonde man, and in an adorable way, he was warm and gave off a kind aura that was comforting to be around. Sadly, she couldn't say the same for that idiot god who fathered her daughter. The god of war, Ares, lived up to his namesake. Damn, she had a habit for falling for the bad boys she never intended to end up sleeping with and get knocked up by a Greek god of all people. But a couple of beers and a few shots of tequila and boom, instant baby. The god of war didn't even bother to stick around in the morning and only bothered to visit her after Clarice was born to inform her of his identity and the challenges Clarice would face one day. He held Clarice once and their daughter had screamed her head off. She couldn't blame her, his aura was the opposite of the blonde barista. Thankfully, Ares didn't frequent Arizona much and they were only in New York to visit her mom. Suffice to say, Clarice's father had yet to make an appearance if he ever did. Shaking her baby daddy out of head, Aline found herself laughing when she spied Clarice reaching for the jam. The little girl looked determined to reach the sweet condiment, though it turned to annoyance when her mother pulled it away. She looks a lot like her father when she's annoyed. Aline could only hope that was all she picked up. Underworld. The goddess of ghosts let out a low huff as she looked out across the never-ending neighborhoods that covered Elysium. Up until this point, Melinoe had a plan to follow the emotional threads from Naruto Uzumaki and see where it took her. She would confront his loved ones and gather what information she could to unravel the mystery that surrounded him. However, Elysium, like its two other havens for mortal souls, was never ending and technically expanded forever as more and more souls filled its valleys. Now that she was within its walls, Melinoe could safely teleport herself across the valley and towards her goal. She couldn't do so before, thanks to the enchantment placed around the valley by Hades and Hecate, which stopped anyone from teleporting in and out from Elysium as they pleased. If someone wanted to visit or leave, they had to walk through the golden gates. Even her father abided by that rule. It was purely for security purposes, but it was still a little annoying. Where to start, she said to herself, standing by the entrance and crossing her arms over her chest. Let's check the map. But Elysium, as never-ending as it was, the Lord of the Underworld came up with the idea to set up a map point after entering through the gate. She remembered the conversation well, her father informing her and her mother of his decision over dinner on the veranda overlooking her mother's garden. He seemed proud of the idea but got defensive when the pair questioned him on why he was making this decision now of all times. Then she remembered the queen of the underworld had dragged her husband to the most godforsaken place known to both humans and gods alike. Disneyland, the idea that her father, the man that invented brooding, spent the day at the happiest place in the world, was comical to imagine. Sadly, there were no pictures. Hades ensured to burn them all before returning. He wasn't going to allow any evidence of the visit becoming public knowledge. The last thing he needed was his younger brothers or the rest of Zeus brood finding out about it. Still, Melinoe was aware amusement parks like Disneyland had maps detailing the entire park on every street and corner, and was positive that's where her father got the idea. Also, Melinoe couldn't help noticing the distinct sound of the song, "It's a Small World," coming from the fields of punishment. She didn't envy those poor souls. Whoever created that damn song deserved 1,000 lashings courtesy of Electo and the Furies. The map was sat in the center of a courtyard as you walk through the golden gates, a fountain built behind it with beautiful water features shaped like animals jumping out of the water. The map was enormous, twice her size and built inside a frame of solid gold. With new souls entering Elysium daily, Elysium divided into sections. Each section resembled the very best of the living conditions from that era, along with additional perks. There was ancient Greece, ancient Rome, medieval, Victorian, Renaissance, just to name a few. Biting her lip, Melinoe couldn't stop herself from shaking her head. None of those felt right. Her eyes initially lingered on ancient Rome and Greece, with the two being among the oldest within Elysium. In her mind, his emotional threads to the dead couldn't have gone any further than ancient Greece, since it housed the souls that first entered the underworld under her father's reign and jurisdiction. Well, that's not entirely true. Her gaze shifted from ancient Greece and slowly turned to another section on the opposite end of the map. There was one area that predated ancient Greece by a sizable amount of time. How long those souls had rested in the underworld was questionable. When Hades came to power alongside his brothers and divided up the sky, sea and underworld amongst themselves, it had taken the eldest son of Kronos decades to wade through everything that waited for him. The underworld, for lack of a better phrase, was a mess when he first arrived. Before the time of the Olympians, the Titans ruled the world. At that time, the underworld was presided over by Iapetus, the fifth son of Gaia and Uranus, and the Titan of mortality, pain and violent death, and the Lord of the West, although given the duty of watching over the underworld as a type of warden for his brother and king. Iapetus shirked his duties and looked at it as little more than a bothersome responsibility. He rarely visited the realm of the dead, and on the rare occasion he did descend to the lower world, he would lie to his brother about the state it was in. In his reports, he would tell the Titan king the underworld was doing great, and the younger brother had no reason not to trust his loyal brother. In reality, the underworld was in pieces. The souls of the dead wandered from corner to corner for eternity. Monsters did as they pleased, and the Furies each ruled a corner of the underworld with dozens of lesser creatures at their disposal. The warden had lost control, and the asylum now belonged to the inmates. Then the underworld was taken over by Hades, and the eldest son of the Titan king took one look at the lower world and decided a change was in order. He decided he needed to put his stamp on his new domain, and he did just that. He brought the Furies under his will and struck fear into the monsters that lived within the underworld. He placed Thanatos as his right hand, and with the god of death in his service, there was no one else that could refute his claim over the domain. When Elysium, the fields of punishment, and the asphodel fields came to be, he ferried the first batch of souls to their rightful homes. Some resisted, in particular, those that belonged to the fields of punishment. However, information about the first batch of souls was the knowledge that Melinoe didn't have. If she had to guess, the souls belonged to the mortals that predated the Olympians. The first batch of mortals created by Gaia during the Golden Age. Hades never spoke about them, and neither did her mother. It was bizarre to think some mortals predated her father. When she asked questions about them, all he did was frown. Could they be the answer? The old souls, huh? The voice came from over her shoulder, freezing Melinoe in her place. Slowly, the goddess swiveled her focus until she found herself staring into familiar green eyes. Hey, wah. Melinoe yelped, jumping back a couple of steps. Hecate. What are you doing here? The goddess of magic shrugged, a nonchalant expression was on her face, though her lips were twitching into a cheeky smile. I followed you. Oh, yeah? No shit. Why did you follow me? How did you follow me? How? Melinoe, I'm an old goddess, older than you, and older than your parents. I still have some tricks up my sleeves, she revealed, serving to annoy the younger immortal. Hecate had this bad habit of popping up when you least expected. Case in point, the situation Melinoe was now experiencing. Back to the matter, you're looking at the old souls. Why? Would you believe me if I said curiosity? No, I don't think I would believe you, she replied in a matter-of-fact tone. I didn't think so, she replied with a sigh. She could feel a headache coming on. You're not going to leave me alone until I tell you, are you? When the gods of magic saw something that caught her attention, she was just like every other goddess attached to their pantheon. She had to know, and she had to have it. It was universal with their family. Crossing her arms, Hecate gave Melinoe a look that few could go up against. Correct, so you may as well tell me why you're suddenly interested in the old souls. Souls that predate the Olympians, and are among the first group of mortals to walk this world. Souls, in which Lord Hades does not talk about with anyone. Souls that are off limits to everyone, and I do mean everyone. Hecate put plenty of emphasis on the final word for Melinoe to notice. Neither spoke for a good minute, but when Hecate's gaze remained stonily calm and focused, Melinoe couldn't do anything but relent. How could she hold such a straight face for so long? It was honestly a complete mystery to her. Fine, I'll tell you, but I'm saying it once, so you better pay close attention. And don't go and tattle on me to father. Very well, now, please explain why you are here. Explain she did, and she told the older immortal everything she knew, including the parts that weren't as important. Hecate didn't react with lively expressions like some gods and goddesses they knew, but one hand did come up and gently rest against her chin in an Athena-like manner. She didn't interrupt, merely listening to the information Melinoe had to give, only reacting with gentle head nods. After Melinoe finished, a twinkle in those emerald eyes of hers told Melinoe enough. Her curiosity was piqued, and Melinoe had a feeling she wouldn't be journeying through Elysium alone anymore. How interesting, I think I'll join you. And there it is, she thought. She hadn't planned to have company on this excursion of hers. However, out of all the immortals she knew, Hecate was one of the more tolerable to be around. Some like her divine uncles, namely Apollo or Ares, would make her want to rip her hair out if left alone with them. The goddesses weren't as bad, but ones like Athena, talking about mind-numbing trivia all that time, sounded like nails on a chalkboard. If it had to be anyone, she could have done far worse than the goddess of magic. I thought as much, she sighed again, sounding sounding like a child who had their Saturday afternoon ruined. Come on, let's get going. Lead the way. The pair of goddesses left the map of Elysium, briefly looking at the dozens of paths that branched off to the different sections, before the goddess of ghosts led them down the one that led to the Old Souls. The area was named the Old World, an apt name given the status of its residents. Melinoe didn't want to say it aloud, but she had no idea what was waiting for them at the other end. It was unknown to her, but she couldn't resist the temptation of her curiosity bubbling up in her stomach. All she could hope for was to get some answers before her father realized where she was and dragged her back. Two in one day, another demigod, Naruto thought, finishing up serving a customer as he turned to the entrance as the door was pushed open. Like earlier with Aline and Claris, a woman and her daughter walked into the fox's den, though the daughter was noticeably older. If he had to guess, the girl was around 4 or 5 years of age. She had dark hair down to her chin, and a row of freckles splashed across her nose, adding an extra dose of adorable. Visibly, she didn't favor the woman much, who had long light blonde hair falling to the middle of her back and sharp features. Even their eyes, though blue, the little girl's were much darker. If he had to compare the shades, the woman's were a pale blue like the sky, the girl's though were the same shade of blue as a Chidori. Like Claris, he could sense the aura around her. She was a demigod for sure, and the pulse coming off her was more potent. If Claris was a splash in the pond, then this girl's was reminiscent of someone cannonballing in the swimming pool. Prepared to walk over, he stopped and stared for a second at the way the woman was moving her body. There was a stagger in her step, and every time one foot went forward, she tilted to one side. It was like watching a seesaw, and her body couldn't decide which way to go. For a brief moment, he watched her steady herself with the help of the little girl. Welcome to the fox's den, please, he started, but halted momentarily as his nose wrinkled. The smell of alcohol clung to the woman like a second skin. It was strong, so strong that he visibly recoiled as it overloaded his sense of smell. Whether or not the woman noticed, she didn't give any indication. However, it confirmed his thoughts. Just drunk, he tried not to frown and kept a smile on his face. Looking at her face, he saw traces of mascara sloppily rubbed away, leaving dark patches on her otherwise clear skin. Please, let me show you to a table. He ushered them to the closest table and brought out the chair for the woman to sit on. Whether the woman was aware of what was going on, he wasn't sure, but the moment she sat on the chair, she slumped forward, her face buried itself in her hands, strands of hair woven through her fingers and nails pinching against her skin. Luckily the room only had half a dozen customers, but those still here looked their way when muffled sobs broke out of the woman. Her daughter sat in the other chair and put her knees up to her chin. She just stared at her mother with those big blue eyes. The woman, for whatever the reason, was not in the right mindset. He didn't know what had caused this woman to end up this way, but maybe he could help her in some way. Pocketing his notebook and pen, he crouched down to the woman's level, gentle asking, "Ma'am? Are you okay?" Whether she heard him or not, she gave no indication. Her muffled sobs only continued as he waited for an answer. "Ma'am? Do you know where you are?" Again she didn't say anything. "Ma'am, my name's Naruto Uzumaki. I own the cafe you've entered, and am worried about your current state. Is there anyone I can call for you?" Again, there was no response, but her sobs. He tried for 5 minutes, to which, half the people in the room got up and left the room. They must have found the situation too uncomfortable to bear, but he paid them no notice. Seeing he wasn't getting an answer from the parent, he tried his luck with the child. Maybe she knew what was going on. Shuffling across the table, he crouched a couple of feet away from the little girl and smiled at her to show it was okay. At first, the little girl did nothing but hide her face in her knees. She was a shy little thing, though he could see her peeking at him from the corner of her eyes. One of her hands came up and played with one of her hair clips decorating her hair. She was a little cutie. "Hi honey," he greeted, trying to use sweet words to show her he could be trusted. "My name's Naruto, and I work here." He motioned with his arms to the interior. "Do you know what's wrong with your mommy?" She didn't say anything, but he did get a little nod from her. "Can you tell me? I'd like to help." She raised her head ever so slightly. He could just about make out her mouth. Help. That's right, he edged a little closer, looking between the girl and her sobbing mother. Did something bad happen to make her sad? Again, the girl nodded. "Can you tell me?" As he spoke to the little girl, the remaining customers slowly filtered out of the room. Some ignored the situation in front of them, while one did show some sympathy and mouth if he needed help. He responded with a soft shake of his head, though he did mouth back a thank you for their consideration. After the last person left, he quickly got up and spun the open sign to close, before returning to the little girl's side, her face scrunched up. Mommy wanted to see daddy." Naruto didn't react, and instead softly nodded. "I see," he replied, thinking over her words. He rubbed his chin. She wanted to see daddy, which meant she tried to see him, but possibly was unable to. If that was the case, then a sticky situation was forming in front of him. If his senses about the little girl were correct, which he knew they were, then this woman had tried to visit her divine partner. He was aware that there were rules set in place by the divine ones. One of those rules, when it came to the children, enforced they had to be raised by the mortal parent. The immortal parent had minor, possibly zero contact with the child. The ones he knew and spent some time with in the past had a similar rule in place, though they watched over their children in secret. For the rest of them out in the world, he couldn't say what rules they had in place, but if he was a betting man, the topic of demigods was likely universal. He returned his attention to the little girl. You didn't get to see him. This time, she shook her head. The man won't let us. The man in the big building. Before he could ask what building she meant, she turned in her seat and pointed to a picture of the New York skyline he put up a few weeks back. Following her finger, his gaze settled on the most iconic building in New York, the Empire State Building. So that's where they live, he thought. He had a feeling that was the case ever since he first sensed the energy that radiated from that building. If he could describe it in one way, it was like a never-ending pulse of invisible energy that few in the world could sense. It was a commanding presence, like it wanted everyone who could sense such things to know they were there. The immortals ones of the world vary, at least, the ones he met anyway. Some kept it under wrap, and others liked to boast and brag. He didn't need to guess what kind lived at the Empire State Building, not to mention, given the regular that visit, which pantheon they belonged to. He said he loved me. He heard and leaned into the sobbing woman. She repeated the same ling over and over again, each with an equal amount of anger and sadness. The scenario was beginning to form in his head and turned to look at the sobbing woman. Her daughter sat quietly next to her. Her gaze flickered between her mother and himself, gently slapping his cheeks. He decided to try and help in whatever limited way he could, a new smile etching over his face. He asked the little girl a question. "What's your name?" "Thalia," she replied, a murmur in her voice. "Well, Thalia, have you ever had a milkshake before?" The little girl blinked, a little unsteadily. She nodded her head and tilted her head to the side. She was too cute. "Well, I happen to be very good at making sweeties and drinks," he replied. "I'm going to get your mom a warm drink to help her feel better. Would you like a milkshake?" "A chocolate milkshake." The word chocolate immediately sparked the girl's interest. Her whole body straightened, and her lips formed a tiny O shape. Instead of answering, she nodded her head a little more vigorously than before. The wonders of chocolate never ceased. "Okay, I'll get right on that," he replied, before turning back to the sobbing mother. "Ma'am, I'm going to get you some water and some food to absorb the alcohol in your system." She didn't answer him back, and nor did he think she would. Standing up, he rubbed the back of his head. What a weird day this was turning out to be. The moment he turned around and headed for the counter, his body stopped when the sound of gagging filled the room, followed by the dreaded sound of vomit hitting the floor. He twisted around, noticing Thalia was no longer in her chair and was now next to her mother, his face scrunched up into a scowl as the woman tried to push her daughter away, a nasty glare forming on the woman. "Get away from me. Mama. I said, get away from me." A harder shove pushed the girl back a couple of feet and sent her sprawling on the floor. Naruto was there in a second, cathing the visibly upset Thalia and leveling her mother with a harsh glare. "Hey," he said, watching the woman turn away and put her back to him. "I don't care what state you're in, you don't harm your child." Thalia sniffled, and the blonde could sense the waterworks beginning to appear. To his mild surprise, he watched her shuffled until she was hidden behind his right leg, her tiny hands clutching at the fabric of his pants. Gently patting her head, he shushed her sweetly. "It's okay, I'm sure your mom didn't mean it." Thump. He threw his head back and groaned. The wreck of a woman and mother of the little girl clutching his leg for comfort fell forward, narrowly avoiding hitting another table and slumped to the ground in her vomit. Heading over to check on her, he crouched on her side and found her out like a light. The day's events, coupled with the booze and heightened emotions, proved too much for her. "Great," he mumbled, rolling the woman over on his back. He took off his apron and rolled it up into a bowl and stuck it beneath the woman's head, rubbing his hand over his face. He looked back at the little girl, the latter of whom was shuffling idly from side to side. Her face was all scrunched up and is sniffling. Despite the situation he was in, he put on the brightest smile he could and shuffled over to her. "Mama's just fallen asleep. Mommy and daddies can be silly like that sometimes." She didn't reply. Instead, she continued to sniffle. He raised his hand and gently patted her on top of her head. What more could he do right now? "I think it's safe to say I won't be opening for the rest of the day," he thought, before doing his best to comfort the upset little girl. Back in Elysium, the goddess of magic and the goddess of ghosts found themselves standing at their destination. "This is not what I expected," Hecate muttered, standing to the left of Melinoe and letting her green eyes travel across her surroundings. They stood in the middle of the gates that led into the lands of the old souls, looking out at the distinct architecture often found with Eastern civilization of old. It expanded as far as they could see. The gates themselves were impressive to look at, comprised of two iron gates a couple of feet thick with a symbol written on the surface in gold. The two halves of the symbol sat on each side of the gate. It took a moment for the older immortal to recognize it. It's a kanji. The kanji? Melinoe replied, a frown on her face, as in those funky letter things they use in the East. Hecate scoffed at the description, but gave a subtle nod. That's right, it's a form of writing comprised of a system of symbols that represent words or ideas, and that can have different meanings and pronunciations depending on their context. It's an old form of written language. How old though is often up for debate. To find them down here though is most odd. Alright, so what does this one mean? Melinoe didn't get an answer right away. She could see the cogs working within Hecate's mind, her index finger and thumb pinching her perfect skin on her brow. I could be wrong, the older immortal said. I never spent much time in the East in my long life, but I did take it upon myself to familiarize myself with some of the languages. Some of my past lovers of whom were from the East wrote in such language you see. The goddess of ghosts made a gagging noise. Hecate shot her a look, but continued, if I'm right, then the kanji written on the gates is the word shinobi. Shinobi? Isn't that another word for ninja? The dark-haired goddess rose a perfect eyebrow. Are you telling the souls of ninjas are the ones living here? The older goddess shrugged. How am I supposed to know? I've never been here before just like you, that's what the kanji reads. Fine, fine, waving her hands in the air, she turned around and looked out at the expanse that made up this part of Elysium. Dense forest populated the area with the tops a shade of green that would have made Pan groan in delight from how healthy they looked. Small mountains dotted a few parts, and from where they stood, they could have sworn they saw tiny dots moving up the side like birds. Dirt roads wove through the lands connecting small villages and towns in various parts of the area. It appeared idyllic to nature lovers. I guess we should follow the closest thread and see where it takes us. And where might that be? Humming to herself as she focused on the threads of Naruto's emotional ties, she soon pointed down one of the dirt roads leading to one of the towns. That way, a particularly strong thread is emanating down that path. I suggest we start with that one. Nothing more needed to be said as the two immortals turned in that direction and headed along the path. They fell into silence, one with a determined expression on her face, while the other stared at her in mild curiosity. The goddess of magic spent most of her time in Underworld. Thanks to her friendship with its lord and his wife, she felt more at ease and at peace in the shadows of the lower world than basking in the light of Olympus. The company was better and didn't force her to socialize with people she cold stomach, not to mention. It was nice not having to deal with gods trying to woo her into their temples. A certain sky god had a habit of trying to wiggle his eyebrows her way. That wasn't happening. Not now and not ever. She didn't desire to be a notch on his belt, nor did she want a vengeful queen turning her eye on her. However, in all her time spent in the underworld, this was the first time she'd seen Melinoe this determined. Melinoe resembled Persephone, but her personality was too much like Hades most of the time, skulking in the shadows and the dark corners of the underworld. Seeing the younger immortal sparked something inside Hecate that forced her to find out what was going on, and so far, she hadn't been disappointed, a mysterious mortal with ties to souls that predate the Olympians. Yes, please. As the mortals would say, Christmas had come early. This is where it stops, Melinoe's voice rang out, forcing Hecate from her thoughts and looking at their destination. Here? She sounded skeptical. You're positive about that? Hey. I swear this is where it stops. Humming to a stop, Hecate and Melinoe found themselves staring at a moderately sized building with a large sliding door made of wooden panels. A thick wall ran on both sides before meeting in the middle, dividing into two. When they were walking closer to the area, there was a distinct shift in the temperature. Now, they understood why. The hot springs. You didn't see many of those in the underworld. The only thing vaguely similar was Hades' hot tub, though only he and his wife were permitted to use it. Each their own, I guess. Maybe these were big back when the old souls were alive. Melinoe shrugged, not having a better answer. I guess. Hecate looked around. She didn't see many souls around, though she could hear a mixture of men and women talking on the other side of the building. Though on a mission, Hecate couldn't help but feel tempted to walk through and indulge with what the hot springs had to offer. The number of times she participated in a hot spring was few, though each time she felt relaxed and rejuvenated. Perhaps she could convince Melinoe to set aside her quest for knowledge for an hour or two. The FFTTT. Both women blinked. Did you hear that? Like someone was giggling. I heard it, though. Where did it come from? Both looked around but saw no one nearby. The FFTTT. There it is again, Melinoe muttered. A frown washed over her face and found herself following after the sound with Hecate hot on her heels. They turned the corner away from the entrance and walked against the large wooden wall that separated them from the hot springs. The path was short, but it did lead them into a small wooded area that rested against the bottom of the establishment. They could feel the steam tickling against their skin. As wonderful as it must have been, they weren't here for that. Ow. That branch hit my face. Then try and duck out the way next time. Pushing against some tall bushes with Melinoe narrowly avoiding another branch to the face, the two goddesses found themselves staring at the back of a fairly large man crouched on his knees with one eye pressed against the fence. A laugh, or a giggle, they weren't sure which, erupted from the man's mouth and didn't appear to notice they were there. The way he laughed, it felt wrong to them. Like he was laughing over something that the pair of them wouldn't agree with or tolerate. It felt wrong. Tilting their heads and tiptoeing to either side of him, they got a good look at the man. The first thing noticeable about the man was his long and shaggy white hair tied into a ponytail that reached his lower back with two shoulder-length bangs framing his face. On his cheeks, they spied red markings going down his cheek emanating from the bottom of his eyes with a small wart of the side of his nose. His clothes were most bizarre and served to help the goddesses in believing the old souls lived in a society similar to the eastern parts of the world they knew. He wore a green short shirt kimono and matching pants, under which he wore mesh armor that is visible at his wrists. He also wore handguards, a black belt, traditional Japanese wooden sandals, and a red haori with two yellow circles on each side. It was a unique look that neither goddesses had seen before. Some kind of warrior? Hecate wondered. Excuse me, but what are you doing? Melinoe's voice rang out, crossing her arms and frowning down at the soul. To both their surprise, he didn't turn around, but he did wave a hand in the air. SSHH. Quiet kid, can't you see him busy? Between him and fence, they noticed a small notebook settled down on the grass with a pen resting between the pages. Busy? Doing what? Research. What else? The two immortals looked at each other before Hecate replied, research. Yeah, so if you could Gray, and he started, turning his head for a brief moment, revealing a small hole in the fence. He was mid-sentence when his jaw dropped, his dark eyes gazing over the forms of the two immortals. It only lasted a moment before a goggle-like expression washed over his face, turning his whole body to face them. Hot mama. You are two smoking babes. Both goddesses blinked, though a pair of scowls quickly appeared on their faces. Excuse me? What did you call me? The latter who spoke was Hecate, who looked at the white-haired man with sudden intensity. She did not take kindly to being called a babe. A funny look washed over the man's face. His hands came up and wiggled in the air. A dust of red appeared on his cheeks. If the goddesses were honest, the look he was giving them gave them the creeps. It was like he was looking through their clothes and ogling them like a piece of meat. Didn't he know who they were? Oh man, I haven't seen you two around here before. You must be new, which is weird because we haven't had new people in a very long time, he replied, taking a step towards them. But hey. You won't hear me complaining. If you don't cease these vile words, I will carve you into tiny pieces. Hey. There is nothing wrong with appreciating a good-looking woman. There is when you look at them like that. Hecate stormed forward. It was rare to see her angry. Usually, the older goddess kept her feelings bottled up inside. However, that was not the case with this man. Melinoe couldn't disagree. The man's behavior irked her. What are you looking at through that hole? Wait. Don't Lou. His words went unanswered as Hecate lowered herself and peeped through the hole in the fence. Watching her from behind, she glared at the man when she caught him staring at Hecate's bottom. She kept a close eye on those wandering hands too. Whatever was on the other side of the fence, it made Hecate go still. She could have sworn she was muttering something underneath her breath. A moment later, a red-faced but angry-looking Hecate leveled him with a glare that would have made Zeus shiver. Why you? She started, her arms shaking at her side. Her eyes shined, and Melinoe could have sworn she felt the ground shake beneath them. You vile pervert. The spear appeared in Hecate's hands and pointed it at the white-haired man, who started nervously laughing. Pushing her way through the goddess and the spirit, Melinoe lowered herself and looked through the hole in the fence. What had gotten Hecate so angry? Oh, she quickly understood. On the other side of the fence was one of the hot springs, in particular, the female side of the hot springs, dotted all over the pool. Melinoe spied at least 24 women, all of whom looked as if they were spawn of the love goddess. Some were basking in the water with just their heads and neck visible, and others had their legs dipped in partway while accumulating a healthy sweat on the top half. Either way, it left nothing to the imagination, and basked the man in all the beautiful curves these women had to offer. After a moment of looking through the peephole, Melinoe stood up and spun around with an eerily calm look on her face. Her eyes though told a different story as she looked at the man accusingly. Pervert. Hey. I resent that term. Then what the hell are you? To their surprise, the man laughed and wiggled his fingers in the air. I'm a big one. Melinoe huffed, wanting to walk away from this man and never see him again as Hecate pointed her spear closer to his face. Unfortunately, to her dismay, she felt a tug in her gut towards the white-haired man. Her face dropped, praying to whoever it was the gods prayed to in these situations, but found them unanswered. The emotional ties that came from Naruto Uzumaki were thrumming stronger than before. It was like a heartbeat getting stronger. As much as she didn't want to believe it, she was 100% sure this awful man in front of her was the one it was connected to. Hecate, what is it? The goddess's emerald eyes never left the man as she kept her weapon inches away from his face. She didn't dare look away from those wandering hands. That's the one. The one? Melinoe gave her a look. You have to be kidding me. I wish I was. But him. I know, I don't like it either. I mean, look at him. There's no mistake. It's not someone on the other side of the fence. I wish it was, but sadly we're stuck with this fiend to women everywhere. I'm still here, you know, the man said, a defeated and annoyed look plastered on his face. His shoulders slumped forward and hung his arms loosely by his side. His lip pouted outwards like a temperamental child. Don't remind us, Melinoe replied with an annoyed expression. Why did she have such bad luck? It was supposed to be a simple mission to gather information. Look, I'm going to set aside what we caught you doing just now if you answer some questions of ours. The man's eyebrow rose. What kind of questions? Well, to start with, you should know my name is Melinoe, goddess of ghosts and daughter of Hades, the lord and ruler of the underworld, she announced, pride evident in her tone, and watched the man's eyebrows raise higher by the second. The woman holding the spear inches from your face is Hecate, goddess of magic. It would be wise not to do anything rash, or she will poke you full of holes. Why your goddess? The man stuttered out, his back pressed against the wall. We are, and we have questions for you. What kind of questions? Melinoe smirked, finally, some answers. Anything and everything about your relationship with Naruto Uzumaki. The second his name left Melinoe's mouth she felt a shift from the man. It was quick, but both goddesses saw his fearful expression change to serious. It was as if a different person suddenly stood in front of them. He stood taller, and it felt like his shoulders widened. Before Hecate could react, she was left wide-eyed when her spear was knocked from her hands and caught mid-air by the man. He spun it around a few times, a whistle in the air before embedding the tip into the earth. Both goddesses were silent at the sudden movement, neither expecting it. What the? So the gawk is still up there, huh? The white-haired man closed his eyes, and a small smile appeared. His words caught them off guard, though Melinoe did take one uneasy step forward. I take then you know who we're talking about. His eyes opened, he still appeared serious, though neither could say he looked hostile, merely prepared should they try something. Early, I dare you to find someone in this neck of the woods who doesn't know the name, Naruto Uzumaki, he replied, crossing his arms over his chest and leaning back against the wood with one foot pressed on the fence. He mumbled something under his breath, though they could have sworn he said, Kushina and Tsunade will be pleased to get news of him. This time, it was Melinoe who stood straighter and put her trepidation to one side. Then who are you to him? Your emotional bond and ties to him are strong, that's how we were able to locate you. Is that right? That's right. A silly grin made its way onto his face. Well. It's nice to know the Gaki still thinks about me after all this time. I swear, that kid knows how to worry me to death, even when I'm dead. He looked into their dark and emerald-colored eyes. Is he doing okay? I've never met him, Hecate replied, a little off-put at how easily he disarmed her. I've only met him once, but he was kind. I've wanted to know more about him since I met him, Melinoe answered honestly. She wanted some answers. She could only hope this man was willing to give some. What can you tell us about him? What can I tell you? He replied, a snort coming from him. I could tell you everything about him if I wanted to. One hand broke from his crossed arms and poked his thumb to his chest. The name's Jiraiya and I'm that blonde knucklehead's godfather. Nice to meet you, ladies. Thanks for watching.